The committee will come to order. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. Today, our committee is focused on a top priority for the American people, pro-growth tax reform that will create jobs, increase paychecks, and strengthen our nation's economy. America now has one of the most costly, unfair, and uncompetitive tax systems in the world. The need for pro-growth tax reform is urgent. Today's high tax rates on American businesses drive good-paying jobs overseas. It makes it much more difficult for our job creators and our workers to succeed here at home. America's burdensome international tax system destroys U.S. competitiveness and discourages investment in our local communities. Scores of loopholes give favored treatment to Washington's special interests, while millions of hardworking Americans haven't seen a real pay raise in years. Here's the good news. President Trump is leading the charge for bold tax reform that will unleash the growth of jobs and paychecks nationwide. And he's calling on the House and the Senate to put forward our best ideas. Our committee is ready to answer that call. Over the past several years, we've held roughly 40 full committee and subcommittee hearings on all aspects of tax reform. All of our members, no matter what side of the dais you sit on, know that tax reform is an economic imperative. Now's the time to go bold. Now's the time to deliver real results for the American people. We welcome all serious solutions that will help achieve that goal. While there's no perfect way to tax, there are proven solutions to grow our economy and improve the lives of all Americans, especially the middle class. So let's take a look at the numbers. Currently, we have the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world at 35%. For small businesses, it's worse. The rates can be as high as 44.6%. To unleash job creation and increase middle-class paychecks, we know these rates have to come down. Washington must take less from Americans' job creators so they can invest more in their businesses, their workers, and their futures. In addition to lowering rates, we also know that bold policies such as full and immediate expensing are incredibly pro-growth for jobs, for paychecks, and for our economy as a whole. According to estimates from the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, this provision alone, allowing businesses of all sizes to immediately write off their business investment in buildings, equipment, software, and technology, will grow America's economy by more than 5% over the next decade, create 1 million full-time jobs, and raise wages and paychecks significantly. Finally, the numbers show us that businesses of all sizes are eager for tax reform. They're ready for the opportunity to innovate, to grow, and to hire new workers. Recently, the Business Roundtable surveyed a group of more than 120 CEOs about tax reform. 82% of them said tax reform will prompt companies to increase business investment, and 3 out of 4 said they will increase hiring. These CEO responses made clear that tax reform will create jobs, create paychecks, and grow our economy. But make no mistake, there are also consequences if we fail to act. 90% of the CEOs said that delaying tax reform will harm the U.S. economy by causing slower growth, slower hiring, and slower capital investment. And more than that, delay would force all Americans to continue to live with the tax code that works against them, not for them. Take it from Roger and Natalie Getz, constituents of mine who own and operate a Mr. Rooter plumbing franchise in Montgomery County, Texas. Roger, who is a friend, and his wife, who are so deeply involved in the community, said, "As a small business owner, I'm scared to death each year and how I'm going to have to pay into the government. That uncertainty is devastating," he says. "It's kind of like trying to operate your business with one hand tied behind your back. Sometimes you feel like both hands are tied behind your back." All small businesses know that feeling. In today's hearing, we'll hear from more business leaders, real live business leaders, about exactly what is needed to get jobs, paychecks, and the economy moving again. Our witnesses are top-level executives from American companies of all size, from 80 workers to 80,000 middle-class workers. Their expertise will help us understand how different proposals will impact America's job creators, workers, and our families. Since releasing our House blueprint for tax reform last June, we've received thousands of comments from businesses and thought leaders. feedback we take very seriously. We look forward to the expert guidance our witnesses will provide today. We thank you all for being here to lend us your insight. Again, there is no perfect way to tax, but there are proven ways to grow our economy. With today's hearing, we will take a critical step toward putting these ideas into action for the American people. With that, I'll now recognize Ranking Member Neal for his opening statement. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing and highlighting the need for tax reform. We all agree the tax code is broken, it's far too complicated, and certainly in need of repair. Our current tax system isn't working for families and businesses alike, and we all agree that any revisions to the code should promote economic growth and create jobs for working families. However, we should reject ideology and work together to reform our tax system for the 21st century. According to a recent Pew study, based on fact, not opinion, the share of adults living in middle-income households in the United States fell from 62 to 59% from 1991 to 2010. Aggregate household income has also shifted from the middle to the upper-income households. Pew's research found that 49% of U.S. aggregate income went to the upper-income households in 2014, up from 29% in 1970. And for middle-income households, the share of income was 43% in 2014, down from 62% in 1970. Wealth is now concentrated at the top, and I assume there's broad agreement on that issue. We can disagree on how that happened, but not to miss the point, greater concentrated wealth at the top is a reality as we proceed to this discussion. Income stagnation is a real challenge and one that needs to be addressed in tax reform. This is in part why working families sent a strong signal to Congress last November. They haven't received a pay raise in years. Their bills are piling up, and they're concerned about uncertain financial security. Put simply, too many feel forgotten and left out by their government. Tax reform should be about moving the dial to help middle-class families prosper. That means focusing on job creation and helping families with day-to-day costs, like housing costs, grocery bills, and child care. It also means helping working families to buy their first home, to send their children to college, and help care for their elderly parents. And of course, it also means helping families save for retirement, and that means protecting the tax incentives in the code for retirement savings. Our focus should be on making sure that when our American families sit down around the dinner table, they can look across at their spouse or their partner and their children and know that things are going to be all right. That is not the case in too many homes across the country today, and that needs to be addressed. That's why Democrats are committing to ensuring that middle-class tax reform is the true winner in any tax reform proposal. The American people don't believe that massive tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires grow the economy. The American family knows that tax reform that provides middle-class tax relief and asks corporations and the wealthiest Americans to pay their share is what will grow our economy. We will oppose any tax plan that simply helps the rich get richer and does nothing for those who really need our help. And all of us should oppose any tax reform that results in a greater burden on the middle class. The Trump tax plan currently fails to meet this standard, and I hope the administration will move back to the test that was set out by Secretary Mnuchin for tax reform, which he stated, quote, "There will be no absolute tax cut for the upper class." Furthermore, the tax reform, if it's to be successful, must be done in a responsible manner. To that end, words like dynamic scoring and supply-side economics are thrown around a lot these days, but make no mistake, tax cuts do not pay for themselves, and anything to the contrary is a non-starter. However, as we consider tax policy and economy-wide effects, I would argue the importance of considering the macroeconomic effects of other policy changes, including an acknowledgement that robust investment in our nation's infrastructure would have significant growth effects throughout our economy. I also think that we should think about using the revenue from a deemed repatriation tax to pay for infrastructure and for other productive investment purposes. In conclusion, we have a unique opportunity to sit down and work together on tax reform. After all, we all agree that the current system is inefficient and underproductive. I stand ready to work in good faith on tax reform with our Republican allies and friends in Congress and also the administration, and only if we do and make the effort to assist the middle class. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. We look forward to hearing from our witnesses as they join us today, and we look forward to a continued and productive conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Today's witness panel includes 5 experts. John Stevens is Senior Executive Vice President and CEO of AT&T, Inc. Zach Model is the Chief Alignment Officer at Atlas Tool Works, Incorporated. David Farr is Chairman and CEO of Emerson Electric. Douglas Peterson is President and CEO of S&P Global. And Stephen Ratner is Chairman of Willett Advisors, LLC. The committee has received your written statements, and they'll all be made part of the formal hearing record. We've reserved 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Mr. Stevens, we'll begin with you, and again, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Brady and Ranking Member Neal, and thank you, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you today. I'm John Stevens. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of AT&T, and I sincerely appreciate this opportunity to discuss the importance of enacting comprehensive corporate tax reform with you today. AT&T is a company with a 140-year heritage of research and innovation that includes 8 Nobel Prizes and more than 15,000 patents and pending patents worldwide. We employ more than 200,000 people here in the United States, and over the past 5 years, we've invested more in the U.S. economy than any other public company, right at $135 billion. One of the biggest issues facing this country is how to unleash economic growth, which has underperformed for the last decade. We can and should do better. The key driver of U.S. economic growth is private sector investment. When investment increases, so does economic activity, hiring, and wages. And when more people are working and making more money, they have more money to spend. However, private sector investment in the U.S., measured as a percentage of GDP, is at its lowest level in generations. It is not surprising that the U.S. economy has been mired in sluggish growth for nearly a decade. If we're serious about robust growth, then we must get serious about jump-starting private sector investment. And the best way to do that is to fix our broken last-century corporate tax code. Achieving competitive corporate tax rates is likely the most effective catalyst available for public policymakers to increase capital investment, create jobs, and increase wages. Lowering the corporate tax rate will also make the United States more competitive globally. We can respond to foreign countries that have implemented modern tax policies to aggressively compete for our jobs and our investment. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to comprehensively update the code for the 21st century and put the U.S. back on top. First, we need to reduce the top corporate tax rate. This is the quickest, most straightforward way to jumpstart investment in our country. It will bring our tax system in line with other developed countries. By reducing the rate, simple economics will drive companies to invest more in America rather than elsewhere. Second, policymakers should allow for the full expensing of capital investments. This is an effective way to quickly stimulate the economy. The Tax Foundation estimates that this policy change would create the equivalent of 1 million full-time jobs. 100% immediate expensing removes the negative effects of taxation on investment, and we know it works. Bonus depreciation, a provision with bipartisan support from this committee, allowed accelerated depreciation that positively affected our investment decisions in those years. Plain and simple, we at AT&T invested more under bonus depreciation than we would have otherwise done. The ability to fully expense investment would do even more to incentivize AT&T and companies throughout the United States to accelerate investment. And more investment directly means more jobs. We recognize that any comprehensive corporate tax reform will involve trade-offs. That's clear. but the key word is comprehensive. Any plan being considered should be judged in totality, not just by a single provision. For example, one area I know the committee has looked at is eliminating interest expense deductibility. Viewed in isolation, that provision would be extremely problematic for me. But I understand that it may be necessary as part of a broader solution. If the committee plans to eliminate interest deductibility, I would encourage you to utilize reasonable transition rules that do not penalize past choices companies like ours have made under a vastly different tax system. This would not only give companies appropriate time to adjust their capital structures to the new system, but also allow them to immediately increase their investment in response to a lower overall tax rate.
Mr. Stevens, thank you for your testimony. 5 minutes always goes faster than it appears on paper. So we will return during the questioning period for you. Again, thank you for being here. Mr. Montel, you're next up. Thank you again for being a witness.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Zach Model. I'm the Chief Alignment Officer for Atlas Tool Works, a fourth-generation family-owned small manufacturer in Lyons, Illinois. I'm here today representing not only my own company, but also the 750 manufacturers who are members of the Technology and Manufacturing Association, TMA, in Illinois. These manufacturers, many in Congressman Roskam's district, are proud to provide good-paying jobs and careers to about 30,000 people in the Chicago area. Most are like mine, small to medium-sized supply chain companies that have survived NAFTA, weathered the China tide, and managed through the Great Recession. Through innovation, modernization, and cost control, we now produce more product than we did 20 years ago. Plus, we're poised to take advantage of the well-earned opportunity for reshoring. We are successfully competing against the best the world has to offer, and we're proud to help manufacture the wealth of America. However, in order to continue our success and grow while creating more good-paying jobs for Americans, we need your help. I'm here today to testify in support of your work to comprehensively reform the U.S. tax code. I believe this is the best and fastest way to grow the U.S. economy and create more jobs in America. I'd like to highlight two things: the opportunity for trade competitiveness through tax reform and the unique pain felt by small manufacturers due to excessive complexity and unfair treatment under the current code. Today, the most difficult barrier to growth American manufacturers face is our self-inflicted tax code. Much of it, written decades ago, fails to account for today's internationally competitive environment. I understand that many are going to argue for simply reducing the current rates, and this might be helpful in the short run, but I believe our economy and our citizens need and deserve permanent, comprehensive reform that also improves America's trade competitiveness. That's why the manufacturers I represent are so pleased that this committee has placed border adjustability at the center of its tax reform efforts. Nearly every one of our trading partners currently use border adjustable consumption taxes, BATs, in the form of value-added taxes, VATs, or good and services taxes, GSTs. These average 17% globally, and they act as tariff and subsidy replacements. Most European Union nations have VAT rates between 17 and 22%, and every American exporter into the EU has to pay those rates to sell their product there. Now, when Mexico agreed to NAFTA, they abolished most of their tariffs, but instead they raised the Mexican VAT to 15%. So they basically built a new tax wall for American products. In India, it's now in the process of adopting a goods and services tax. Furthermore, any country that wants to mimic a currency devaluation can increase their VAT and use the proceeds to reduce other domestic taxes. In reality, I believe tax policy and trade policy, they go hand in hand. And I believe that tax policy has far greater effect on trade than any trade agreement ever could. Good tax policy, one that encourages domestic production and exports, is in effect good trade policy. Moreover, it's unilateral. We don't need to negotiate with anyone. We don't need to ask permission from any international body, and we don't need to risk sparking a trade war. Remember, every one of our trading partners has already some type of a BAT system. So we simply need to change our tax laws, and immediately American producers regain their edge, and the working men and women can get a tax break. In short, I want to get back to a world where American producers compete and win on price, quality, and service. The second point I want to highlight today is the importance of simplifying the tax code and reducing the overall rate. My company, it's like many small manufacturing businesses in America. We're often family-owned, we usually own our own real estate, and we do not have a significant staff of tax experts. We work hard to be competitive, create jobs, and pay our fair share. Consider that small businesses have provided some of the fastest employment and output growth in the United States, but we receive some of the worst tax treatment under the code. Usually, smaller manufacturers are paying the highest rates because we do not have the resources to develop a globally comprehensive tax avoidance plan. That's why I believe we must reduce the overall rate, offer a reduction in payroll taxes, and fund these reductions through BATs. It's also important to simplify the tax code and avoid disadvantaging small businesses, subchapter S and LLCs. These types report the taxes on the owner's personal tax reform. The calculations, they're excessively complicated. My own family business, which together employ about 80 people, have 3 different tax structures, 1 C Corp, 2 S Corps, and 1 LLC to hold the real estate. TMA member companies like mine and tens of thousands of others throughout the United States, we're not looking for a handout or an unfair advantage. What we're hoping for is a level playing field from our tax code and the opportunity to earn our prosperity by, again, competing on price, quality, and service. All we're asking for from Congress is a permanent tax code that drastically improves our competitiveness through a move toward a more simplified and reduced tax system that places the emphasis on a border-adjustable component. This reform will provide a level playing field so that we can dramatically increase good-paying American jobs and grow the American economy at a rate we've not seen in decades. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this input. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Model. Mr. Farr, you're recognized and welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Brady, Ranking Member Neal, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you on this critical U.S. economic growth issue. My name is David Farr. I'm Chairman and CEO of Emerson in St. Louis, Missouri, and serve as the current Chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers, NEM, Board of Directors. Emerson is a $15 billion manufacturing company providing innovative products, solutions, in industrial, commercial, and residential markets, and we have over 80,000 people in operations in more than 150 countries. The NEM, the nation's largest industrial trade association, is committed to a policy agenda that helps manufacturers grow and create jobs. We appreciate the current efforts to advance pro-growth and permanent tax reform. Manufacturers in the United States struggle to compete and win. Under a tax system with high tax rates and outdated international tax rules and a significant tax compliance burden, we have the best chance in over 30 years to advance significant tax reform and must take full advantage of this opportunity. It will enhance U.S. economic growth. Since the last major reform in 1986, manufacturers in the U.S. have innovated, but the tax code has not. With a combined statutory corporate tax rate that can top 39%, manufacturers in the United States face the highest corporate tax rate among OECD nations, and this is a competitive problem. And top rates for manufacturers organized as pass-through entities can be even higher, and this hurts their investment opportunities. Over the past 3 years, Emerson paid $1.8 billion annually in taxes worldwide. More than half of that was paid in the United States. At an average effective tax rate of approximately 32% and a marginal tax rate of over 37%, Emerson pays real tax cashes here in the United States. A key NEM objective shared by Emerson is a top federal tax rate of only 15%. We must also lower tax rate for pass-through entities, including many smaller companies in the U.S. manufacturing supply chain. Lower rates will make manufacturing more competitive, encourage greater investment in the United States, and promote job creation and stronger economic growth. Outdated and cumbersome tax rules for taxing international income represents another major problem. Emerson's business is global. More than 52% of our sales in 2016 were outside the United States. As a U.S. company headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri, Emerson typically pays more in taxes on worldwide earnings than our foreign competitors. This is another competitive issue. Most developed countries have territorial systems, and their global companies pay little or no tax when they bring their foreign earnings back home. The United States, on the other hand, has a worldwide system, meaning global U.S. companies, where they do business, they pay taxes, as well as in the United States when we bring their earnings back home. This added tax burden is a significant disadvantage when U.S. companies are competing for global business. To improve U.S. competitiveness, any tax reform plan should include a territorial system. similar to those in other countries where our competitors are headquartered. This will increase U.S. jobs, exports, and strengthen U.S.-based suppliers, and allow for the flow of capital back to the United States for investment right here in America. A tax reform plan must encourage long-term capital investment by allowing accelerated depreciation of newly invested assets, one of the most important being the full expensing the first year. Expensing lowers the after-tax cost of capital, can drive increased investment and economic growth along with job growth. At the heart, as the head of a global manufacturing company headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri, I strongly support a robust R&D incentive. Continuous research and development investment is critical to ensuring that the United States remains a leader in global innovation and maintains Americans' competitive advantage in technology. U.S. manufacturing want the United States to be the best place to compete and manufacture in the world. We want to attract direct foreign investment. A permanent tax reform that reduces the corporate tax rate to 15%, provides lower tax rates for pass-through entities, moves to a territorial system, maintains a strong R&D incentive, and includes faster capital cost recovery, will ensure we achieve this goal and improve our country's competitiveness and ability to grow. We operate in a fiercely competitive global economy, and we need a fiercely competitive tax system, and we need it now. Emerson and the NAM are committed to working with you to advance this much-needed tax reform as soon as possible. Mr. Chairman and the committee members, thank you very much for having me here today, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Farr. Mr. Peterson, welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you. Good morning. Chairman Brady and Ranking Member Neal, thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my perspective on how tax reform can help U.S. companies of all sizes better compete in the global marketplace. I'm Doug Peterson, President and Chief Executive Officer of S&P Global. Our commitment to transparency, integrity, and superior analytics has been at the forefront of U.S. economic growth since our founding over 150 years ago as a small business. Beginning with the expansion of the nation's railroad system, to the rise of the world's most liquid and resilient capital markets, to the growth of digital information technology, S&P Global's essential intelligence has remained independent and guided important decisions throughout U.S. history. Today, I want to thank the committee for all the work you have been doing to reform the tax code. I offer you my continued support as you move through the legislative process. My message to you today is twofold. First, we need to reform the U.S. tax system, including lowering the corporate tax rate to level the playing field and putting in place a more competitive international system. Second, we need a permanent, comprehensive fix that will promote investment, innovation, and growth in the U.S. economy to support American companies and American workers. S&P Global competes on an international level. While we have grown significantly since our inception, we have kept most of our intellectual property in the U.S., which means we pay a large majority of our taxes in the U.S. Since the U.S. currently has the highest statutory corporate tax rate among the countries in the OECD at 35%, we have a much higher effective tax rate than our international competitors. For example, Canada has dropped its corporate rate from 36% to 26%, and the United Kingdom will have a rate of 17% by 2020. In fact, throughout S&P Global's history, we have consistently paid an effective tax rate of over 30%, while many of our competitors pay in the low teens. This high rate hurts our ability to compete against companies located in countries where corporate tax rates lower their overall costs. With a less competitive international system, U.S. companies face an uphill battle. Currently, when foreign companies established in a country with a territorial tax system sell goods into the U.S., they pay little, if any, corporate tax here. In addition, foreign companies may pay little to no corporate tax when they return profits home. In contrast, U.S. businesses that sell goods and services to foreign customers are taxed fully in the U.S., and more than $2.5 trillion in profits from U.S. companies is offshore today, something that doesn't happen under other tax systems. The basis of our tax code was designed after World War II, when our economy was geared towards manufacturing and agriculture. The last rewrite in 1986 occurred before the internet and the information economy, which introduced new, innovative business models. The emergence of technology, advanced manufacturing, modern agriculture, the growth of intellectual property, and the globalization of markets are all new features of our economy. The tax code, though, has not evolved with the economy. The result is a highly unfair system that undermines competitiveness. The tax inequities that advantage foreign competitors over their American counterparts can be traced to this antiquated code. It's time for a change. For decades, the United States has been the birthplace of innovation and new business formation. We should use this opportunity for comprehensive, permanent tax reform to ensure it continues to be the engine of growth for small businesses, startups, and other American job creators. Today, we are losing ground, and we should be leading. I hope Congress will seize this moment and enact substantial changes that will foster investment, growth, and jobs in the U.S. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony, and I look forward to having a discussion with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Ratner, you're recognized, and again, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Neal for having me here today. I speak as someone who has spent 35 years in the private sector as an investment manager, meeting with companies, analyzing companies, investing with companies, as well as having spent time in the Treasury in the early part of the Obama administration. And I would certainly concur with what every single previous speaker has said about the need for comprehensive tax reform after 30 years of neglect. However, in my opinion, any major tax legislation should meet several important tests. First, it should be deficit neutral, given projections for rising fiscal gaps. Second, it should be fair and certainly not diminish the progressivity of our system. Third, it should be growth and investment enhancing. Fourth, it should improve our international competitive position. On that basis, the proposal by the administration falls short in several important respects. While the President's focus on tax reform is laudatory, his one-page plan includes far more detail on how the administration would cut taxes than on how it would pay for those reductions. Based on the information provided, nonpartisan researchers have estimated that its net cost could be $5 trillion to $6 trillion over the next decade. Without adequate offsets, these tax cuts would drive up interest rates, the deficit, and the federal debt. And I would note that the deficit is already rising again. These projected deficits would be substantially exacerbated by the Trump plan. Again, before incorporating the administration's plan, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget forecasts that the ratio of debt to gross domestic product, already at a historic high of just under 80%, would rise sharply and could reach 89% by 2027, above every previous high except for a short period after World War II. The Trump plan would drive this ratio to an astounding 111% by 2027, even as we continue to deal with the effects of an aging population. To counter these concerns, the Trump administration appears to be resurrecting the discredited supply-side theory that high deficits resulting from tax cuts don't matter because faster economic growth will quickly close the gap. That's not what happened following the Reagan tax cut of 1981, and by the end of Reagan's tenure, roughly two-thirds of his tax reductions had been reversed. Nor is it our experience following the tax cuts pushed through by President George W. Bush in 2001 and 2003. To pay for the Trump plan, we would need average growth of 4.5% per year. That has not happened on a sustained basis in modern history and is highly implausible in the future, given our current aging and productivity trends. For its part, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects approximately 2% growth for the next decade. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin believes that annual growth of 3% is attainable from the Trump plan. I know of no independent economist who thinks that is possible. And even if it were, the result would be about $2 trillion of additional revenues, far short of what is needed. Second, on fairness. Given the economic strains on middle and working class Americans with which we are all familiar, it is critical that any tax reform plan be focused on helping these Americans. However, the details of the Trump plan unassailably contradict Secretary Mnuchin's assertions that there would be no net tax cut for the rich. The plan includes lowering the top rate on earned income, eliminating a 3.8% levy on investment income, and doing away with the estate tax and the alternative minimum tax. Yes, some deductions are to be eliminated, most notably for state and local taxes, but when the Trump administration provides enough information for experts to score the proposal, I have no doubt that the rich will be the big winners. Gary Cohn, the director of the National Economic Council, has argued the increase in the standard deduction qualifies Mr. Trump's plan as a middle-class tax cut. The problem is that a family of two or more pays less tax under current law than it would under Mr. Trump's plan because of the availability of both a standard deduction and personal exemptions, which Mr. Trump said in the campaign he would end. Third, regarding growth and investment. While the large tax cuts could be viewed as enhancing short-term growth, the size of Mr. Trump's tax cuts and lack of progressivity will quickly overwhelm the positive benefits. Most importantly, rising interest rates will soon squeeze out private investment. The Tax Policy Center has estimated that his plan would reduce GDP by 0.5% after a decade and 4% after 2. Fourthly, it should enhance our international competitive position. I would agree that the need for corporate tax reform is without question. While the stated rate for U.S. companies is 39%, many pay far less because of the use of avoidance techniques. As a result, the average corporate tax rate is 10 to 15 points lower than the statutory rate. That is unfair to many stakeholders. What should be done is a thorough elimination of abusive practices such as transfer pricing in return for lowering of the standard rate to 25%, which is in line with the OECD's unweighted average. I'd like during the questions to talk more about issues like the trapped cash that were referred to in the earlier comments, but for the moment I would close by simply agreeing again that a comprehensive tax bill is long overdue, but it needs to be deficit neutral and it needs to be fairer to the average American as well as reforming our corporate tax system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ratner, and we will begin questions. So, fixing our broken tax code only occurs once in a generation. It's important we do this right. The goals House Republicans developed for this once-in-a-generation opportunity is first, rather than a tax code designed merely to wring money from you, we already have that one, we want a tax code built for growth, literally designed to grow jobs, grow paychecks, and grow the U.S. economy. And as we're doing that, leapfrog America from nearly dead last among our global competitors into that top 3 and keep us there. That means designing a tax code where our local businesses can compete and win anywhere in the world, especially here at home. And so we are going all in on growing middle-class jobs and growing middle-class paychecks. So let's begin with the bipartisan issue. For years, here in this room and back at home, we've heard from our businesses, large and small, about the importance of investing back into their workers and into their future. That's what led us, Republicans and Democrats, together to support issues like what we call bonus depreciation and Section 179 small business expensing. It's all about rewarding businesses for investing in buildings, equipment, software, and technology. But we want to go bolder. And as you know, the House blueprint calls for a shift from an onerous business income tax to a U.S.-based, simpler cash flow tax system. And at the heart of that, we would provide for a full and immediate write-off of all that new business investment. And that investment, by the way, not only is the key to middle-class and Main Street job growth, it's key to making our workers more productive. That's what drives wages. That's what drives America to the lead pack and having the strongest economy on this planet. So I want to start with our witnesses. So can you explain how having access to full and immediate write-off of your business investment will lead you to invest more in growth and jobs, both for you and for customers, for example, and businesses who are making those investments themselves? Mr. Stevens, we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very directly, just as it has with bonus depreciation over the last few years for our company, we would invest more with immediate expensing. We would take the dollars saved on that tax return and invest those in more capital. When we do that, we invest in research, we invest in technology, we invest in productivity. For us, that means building out more broadband. For us, that means building out more fiber optics. Those provide jobs, not only the engineers who design and the researchers who develop those new 5G type systems, but our proud employees who actually construct those and who build those and who maintain those. And so they are going to have better jobs, they're going to have higher wages, and therefore the entire ecosystem is going to be better off. I will also tell you, you'll have a direct impact on our property tax liabilities. So the state and local and county governments will get more revenues because we do pay property taxes, sales taxes,
yes,
taxes on all that investment. So it is a virtuous cycle of economic growth that comes out of additional business fixed investment.
Does it also make your customers, many are small businesses and other businesses, buying this technology, really upgrading your equipment, your computers, all your technology can be expensive. So being able to write that off immediately, does that help small businesses be able to invest more in the types of technologies you're offering?
Yeah, certainly. Many of our vendors, many people in our supply chain are small businesses. Many of them are diverse businesses. So they would be immediately helped. It would help them generate their business. And from a perspective of being what I think most would consider a large business, small businesses are some of our best, most wonderful customers. We want small business in this country to succeed. It's good for the demand on our services.
Absolutely.
So this is a complementary situation, not one that is in different views. We want small business to have that opportunity to succeed in this environment.
Thank you. And so that leads to a family-owned business who both invests in your plant, but customers who are buying your products as well. Mr. Model, from your standpoint, the ability to write off those new investments going forward, both for you and your customers, what's that impact?
Well, that's really important for us, Mr. Chairman. Since 2015, my company has invested $3.5 million in new equipment and new plant. Right now, we're doubling the size of our plant, putting on an addition right now. All of those types of things, immediately expensing them, that would really help us. And for our sales are just under $10 million. So from a perspective of a percentage-wise, we're really investing in the future. We believe in it. And I think that an accelerated depreciation would certainly help us continue to do that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Model. Mr. Farr, manufacturing. If you want to stay competitive, you got to reinvest all the time in your business. Exactly. It's expensive. And your customers are reinvesting. They're buying those products. So how, for the first time in history, all businesses of all sizes immediately being able to write off from their taxes that business investment, what impact does that have?
It has a significant impact on our returns. Obviously drives a higher level return from the standpoint of the cash flow, gets our cash back to us, which gives us more money to invest down the road. I mean, we've invested over the last 5 years over $3 billion in capital. Capital drives growth, capital drives productivity, it drives jobs. But having a return on that, obviously at a higher level, and the cash coming back into the corporation gives us more money to invest in capital, people, and growth. And that will drive a faster economic growth overall.
Thank you, Mr. Farr. And that sort of illustrates the power of a simpler cash flow system that really focuses on that. Mr. Peterson, your insight, sort of looking at a broader range of the economy, but the technologies and services that you sell as well. What's the impact of being able to immediately write those down and capture that cash, make those new investments?
What's most important for us is that it would allow us to keep those jobs in the U.S. Today there is a competitive environment because other countries around the world have such low tax rates. In fact, there's countries calling on us. We receive relationship management calls from other countries, from Singapore, from Ireland, where they come visit us to ask us to move those jobs to those countries. They're high-paying jobs that it will require economists, quants, mathematicians, people designing new intellectual property. They want that intellectual property overseas. These types of tax changes will allow us to continue to develop our products and services in the U.S. We'll invest in the U.S. In the last 2.5 years, we've invested in large operations in Charlottesville, in Texas, in Colorado, and in New York. And this would ensure that we would continue to do those investments in the United States.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Ratner, thank you for bringing your criteria forward on pro-growth tax reform. Bring those solutions and principles are extremely helpful. So your viewpoint, you work and see many clients, whether they are in manufacturing or technology, small or large businesses, investment growth, the growth that comes from that investment in incentives. So your view on unlimited, immediate, all-size business investment in those productive investments, what impact do you see from this provision?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would certainly concur with others that the rate of investment in this country is below what it should be. Secondly, I would certainly concur with the notion that if you gave someone, for example, immediate write-off of all of their capital expenditures, that they would invest more. That's fairly obvious. If you give somebody money to do something, they're likely going to do more of it. But I think that the focus on this provision is excessively narrow in terms of what is affecting investment in this country. When I spend time talking to CEOs and companies, sure, if you lower their taxes, they might invest more. But they also are faced with the fact that demand in this country is quite weak because personal incomes have been quite weak because wages haven't gone up. And so they're investing more money in other parts of the world where they see faster growth and more demand. And so that I think the question of investment in this country has to be viewed more holistically in the context of how do we get growth here. And this may be one piece of the final solution, but it is not the holy grail. It is not going to single-handedly solve the investment challenges in this country.
Well, Mr. Ratner, I agree. We have to take tax reform in a comprehensive way and put together a number of pro-growth provisions, but the investment part of this is key to middle-class growth, and the estimates of the House blueprint are that it will raise the average after-tax wages family by $5,000, again, helping create the demand that helps grow our economy as well. So thank you all for those responses. Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ratner, let me begin by taking a moment to thank you for your leadership and to recognize the success of the automobile restructuring that took place during the midst of the recession. I remember having extensive conversations with individuals like Mr. Levin at the time, and our greatest fear was that if that industry entirely collapsed, the R&D would have been moved offshore permanently, and trying to get it back would have been near impossible. So I think we begin by thanking you for what you were able to do to help turn around that industry, and also to thank you for your government service. And as I noted in my opening statement, Mr. Ratner, my priority for tax reform is the middle class. The middle class has contracted in the United States over the past 2 decades, while those at the top have done better than ever before. That is not a statement that comes from a Democratic manifesto. It is from the Pew Foundation and many think tanks across the country. Working families did send a strong signal last November. They're frustrated by stagnant wages. They're tired of a tax code that favors the big over the medium-sized incomes across the country, and greater concentration of wealth again at the top. They're anxious about a very uncertain financial future. And the true winners of tax reform must be middle-class Americans and their families. In your testimony, Mr. Ratner, you agreed with the position that was offered, that it's critical that any tax reform plan be focused on helping middle and working families. Would you please provide us with some suggestions that you might have? And I hope that you will also have a chance to touch upon the need for greater retirement savings incentives in our code for the very families that I've just described. So addressing income stagnation and retirement savings and rising income inequality is a big problem in America. Based on your experience, Mr. Ratner, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you, Congressman Neal. I think any tax reform package needs to be a balance. It needs to address a variety of needs. We've talked a lot in the first part of this about investment, but you've now talked about the situation with the average American. I don't believe, in response to Chairman Brady's comment, that while there certainly would be indirect effects on average Americans of investment tax benefits, I don't believe that that's the most direct way to help them. I think it is, frankly, a kind of a form of trickle down. I think when you look at the tax proposal that's been made by the administration, you'll see that it's very unbalanced. It has not yet been scored, but President Trump's campaign proposal was scored, and 83% of his tax plan would have gone to the top 20% of Americans who would have gotten an average of a $25,000 tax cut. The middle-class average American would have gotten a $1,000 tax cut. That's not my view of what a fair and balanced tax plan would look like. So I think part of the equation is to give middle-class Americans more of a tax cut so that they can go out and spend, and they can help get our growth rate up to a higher level. With respect to the question of retirement savings, that's a whole other subject, but we have a huge problem of retirement savings in this country. 401ks and IRAs have created some benefits, but they have also led to a vast amount of undersaving by Americans who are facing a really tough time in retirement, and I think we need to think about a fairly comprehensive restructuring of that whole program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Mr. Nunes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's safe to say that all of you have expressed some level of support for moving to a cash flow system. And one of the opportunities that we have during hearings like this and this being one of the first hearings that we're going to have, multiple hearings, I think, over the course of the next few months, is having folks like yourselves be able to speak before the American people here in Congress, but begin to talk about these, switching from an accrual system to this cash flow system with full expensing and all of the benefits that that will do for the American people in terms of not only growth in the economy, but also wage growth. And why don't we just start with you, Mr. Stevens. Having a big, one of the largest companies in the United States, the opportunity to go from the complicated accrual accounting system, where I'm sure you have an army of lawyers and tax accountants, switching to a cash flow system like this, I think this is going to give your folks that work with you some real opportunities to get away from trying to navigate the complicated tax code and begin to look at where best to invest money for your company. And I don't know if you could expand on that and explain some of the opportunities this would give you.
Certainly simplification of the process and the simplification that might be required to provide some balance to comprehensive tax reform would be very helpful. You're right, we file over 250,000 tax filings a year here in the United States. And yes, we do have a large collection of professionals who work hard to make sure we live up to all those laws. Quite frankly, for our perspective, the provisions of a lower rate and incentive to invest in capital would be the most effective way for us to increase our investment and through that hire more people, generate more jobs through our supply chain, generate more research with technology development, and quite frankly, improve the wages of our employees and quite frankly of their peers who work for other companies. And as that goes through the system, it would generate demand for our services, and that's the real answer for economic growth. As the peer companies that are represented today from all sizes invest, they would put demand on our services, they would put demand for labor and for wages, and you would see growth of a significant level, we believe, for all. And then for us, it would generate on the top line. So yes, there would be simplification, but we are a large company. We have resources. That simplification aspect is really much more beneficial, I think, to the small and medium-sized businesses, and they're very important to our company because they make up some of our best customers.
Well, I think that's a great transition because sitting next to you is a small businessman from Illinois. Mr. Mata, welcome. I have a district that has a lot of small businesses, and I think having you here today sitting next to one of the largest companies in the United States really shows how we can get big businesses in America and small businesses in America to agree that moving to a cash flow system like this would be very beneficial. And so could you walk us through just kind of the opportunities that moving to this system would give a small business like yours, Mr. Muddle?
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, you pointed to the relationship here. I'd like to point out AT&T and the telecom industry was one of the biggest customers of my company for almost 100 years. We built a lot of the components of the phone network. So the supply chain relationship that we're talking about is so important. If my big customers are healthy and they're buying parts and pieces and product from me, I'm happy. That's tax reform for me, making my big customers competitive and able to do business in the U.S. I think in relation to the tax that we're talking about, the cash flow tax, I've seen some models that maybe have a little concern for small businesses, but I would just ask you to consider maybe thinking about a border adjustable profit tax as you move through that. It's very similar to what you're talking about, but maybe would focus more on profits and cash flow. But either one of the models is a great improvement, and again, anything that simplifies, reduces, and gets my customers happy and doing business with me, it's a great tax reform for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muddle. I've got a few seconds left, Mr. Farr.
Yes, I have to agree. Having healthy small businesses is very important. They're key suppliers of ours. If I can redirect money from tax compliance and paying tax or doing tax forms to engineering and new products and innovation, that will obviously grow the economy, because that's productive assets which go into growing the economy and making new products and helping America be competitive. So that's really allows us to redeploy where our assets go into productive parts of the economy. Not saying tax lawyers aren't productive, but I'd rather make a new product and
we know that,
facilities.
Mr. Farr.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yield it back, Mr. Chairman.
We would never say that. Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you lawyers and non-lawyers. You know, I think there's general agreement we need to look at the corporate tax structure, and the Obama administration did so. And I think the question is how and in what environment. I just want to read from a new report, just a couple months old, from U of Chicago Booth entity, and I quote, "I find that the stimulative effects of income tax cuts are largely driven by tax cuts for the bottom 90%, and that the empirical link between employment growth and tax changes for the top 10% is weak to negligible, and even a business cycle frequency." And then I'll continue reading. "If policymakers aim to increase economic activity in the short to medium run, this paper strongly suggests that tax cuts for top income earners will be less effective than tax cuts for low income earners. Overall, the results not only suggest some skepticism for trickle-down economics, but they also provide evidence that supply-side tax policies should do more to consider the relative efficacy of tax cuts targeted lower in the income distribution." So I just want to mention that when we talk about comprehensiveness, just let's keep in mind whom we're trying to benefit, jobs. There's much talk on the Republican side about middle class. The Trump proposal is the opposite of it. Also, I just want to make a comment, Mr. Stevens, one of your statements, "Our current tax system also harms workers. They bear up to 75% of the corporate tax burden through lower wages." I just suggest there be some caution, because corporate tax profits have increased dramatically while wages have stagnated. And I think there's much doubt, if I might say so, about that reference. Let me just say a word about bonus depreciation. We tackled that a couple years ago, and CRS made clear that the efficacy of bonus depreciation depended on its being temporary. And that's why it was enacted in the first place, as a boost during a recession. And so when you essentially adopt it in a non-recession period, the CRS casts immense doubt on its efficacy over the longer run. And I mention this because I think we need, on a bipartisan basis, to take a hard look at these issues and not kind of just put them out there as if there's some kind of a magic wand, because CRS essentially says it is not, and indeed Dave Camp left bonus depreciation out of his proposal altogether. I want to ask each of you quickly, none of you except Mr. Ratner have talked about the impact on the deficit and how we pay for a corporate tax reform. Are you concerned about this, or are you among those who say, let it flow? If the deficit increases, it will essentially bring about economic growth? Just quickly, there's just a minute. Are you worried, each of you, about paying for corporate and other tax reform?
Representative Levitt, I could start. Certainly we are, as a member of the group of companies that operate here in the United States and part of our, this is our home. Absolutely. That's why in our comments we talked about trade-offs.
Okay.
Comprehensive reform, there will be trade-offs. We understand that, and that is just something that we're going to have to work through so that we come out with a complete and workable package.
Mr. Moto, are you concerned?
Yes, Representative, but I want you to have your cake and eat it too. I've given you the opportunity to, with the goods and services tax, to pay for the corporate tax cut and give working Americans an immediate boost to their paycheck. So I hope that answers it.
Congressman Levin, I would say yes, I'm concerned about the deficit as an individual taxpayer and a CEO, and I look for trade-offs back and forth to make sure we do this right for the economy on a balanced basis. So I think it's very important.
Mr.
Right.
Peterson,
Thank you. All time has expired, Mr. Levin. So I would point out the House Republican blueprint as designed balances in the budget, counting on economic growth, just properly measured. Mr. T. Berry, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo your comments, Chairman, earlier about full expensing and how important it is, and that's why I've been an advocate of 179, making 179 expensing permanent, bonus depreciation. I'm not going to take the bait and ask someone to respond about bonus depreciation because I think that was covered as well. Business investment, as all of you know, declined last year for the first time since the recovery began. Not a good sign. So before I ask my question, I want to thank you all for sharing your experiences, but one of the things in Mr. Stevens and Mr. Farr's testimony that struck me as so important as underlying debate and letting the perfect be the enemy of the good is the cost of delay. Now, we can pick apart any piece of this, but the cost of delay is so important. And how do we put a cost to that delay? And as the rest of the world has reformed and lowered rates and taken our jobs, we continue to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'd like each of you to comment, if you could, in terms of jobs, in terms of economic growth, in terms of investment. What is the cost of delaying? We've been talking about tax reform here on this panel for years now, and yet we continue to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Mr. Stevens, what's the cost of delaying this again?
So lost wages for our working class today, it's underemployment, it is participation rates in the workforce that are at historically low levels.
And middle class workers are probably the bulk of your employees.
By far the bulk. We are the largest, we believe we're the largest union employer in the country. We have over 120,000 represented workers. We're proud of them. They do great work for us. They would be the largest beneficiaries of the additional capital investment because they are the ones who do much of that work.
So your headline is the cost of delay impacts the middle class worker.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Mr. Modell.
Yeah, absolutely. Delay cannot happen. You know, we saw what happened with the markets yesterday because they're concerned people we're not going to get things done here. So, you know, I've invested all that money in my business, and I'm expecting to get a return on it and be able to pay back the investors, my family, and the bank. So I need my customers to be healthy. I need tax reform right now. My employees need it as well. They want to start saving and getting ready for the future.
Mr. Farr, thank you for your investment in Ohio, by the way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're moving ahead because I'm assuming this body will get true tax reform done in Ohio with a $100 million investment there right now. But the cost of delay means lack of innovation, less new products, less jobs, and it's that simple. We just look at how much growth is going to be, and we pare it back based on delay, and every time it's delayed, we push that investment out. And so it does have a real impact on people, how we hire, investment, new products, but I fundamentally believe that we will get tax reform, and that's why we're moving forward in Ohio, Wisconsin, and down in Texas and Missouri right now, because I think that this body understands the importance of getting real tax reform in the first time in over 30 years. So we're betting on you that you're going to get it done.
Mr. Peterson?
The cost of delay is also the cost of investment. If the delay is to not get a lower rate and not to get a territorial system, we're going to see more companies looking for some sort of inversion, not bringing their cash flow back from offshore. Just recently, one of the companies in our industry did a $3.3 billion offshore investment with their offshore cash. We have no chance of getting any of that cash back to the United States.
Great point. Mr. Ratner, don't ruin the picnic now.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Don't ruin our picnic.
I'm not going to ruin your picnic, Congressman.
Thank you.
We can all agree on that, on your question. I don't think there's there's a lot of disagreement probably on exactly what we should do, but I don't think any reasonable person could disagree that sitting where we are sitting now, having done nothing really for 30 years in terms of comprehensive tax reform, has cost us millions of jobs, billions of dollars, and so on. And every day when I pick up the paper and read about another company either moving itself or moving its jobs overseas, it really upsets me because I think we could be doing something about that right now.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
With that agreement, we ought to probably stop the hearing at this point, just so you know. Thank you very much. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ratner, I want to join Ranking Member Neal for thanking you for your service to our country. Mr. Ratner, I'm very concerned about fairness and values in comprehensive tax reform. Some have said this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. I think we must take our time and we must do it right. We must get it right. As we consider tax reform, do you think it is important to consider the impact on working families and future generations when reform tax policy, when we consider reforming the tax policy?
Yes, I do think it's important. As I said, I think it's just as important as getting comprehensive tax reform at removing the loopholes and avoidance techniques both for individuals and for companies, as well as getting the corporate tax system fixed. I think it needs to be fair, and I think it needs to have a positive impact for the average American. I think to have a $5.5 trillion tax bill that involves a $1,000 tax cut for an average American making $50,000 a year doesn't seem fair to me. I think there needs to be fairness. As I said earlier, I think the comments on business investment, which I understand why they're being made, affect the supply side principally of more investment, more factories. That's all good. But we also need to do things on the demand side of putting people in a position to earn higher wages so that they can go out and spend more and get the economy growing faster. So while I do share the view that we need comprehensive tax reform, I am very troubled by the proposals that are on the table, both from the administration and the House blueprint that the chairman has referred to a few times, in terms of the balance of not just fairness, but also of stimulating every part of our economy, not just the investment side of our economy.
Do you have any recommendation what we should be doing? Look at the panel. Just look. All white men. Where are the women? Where are the minorities? Where are the low people? Would you like to respond?
Representative Lewis, from AT&T, we take great pride in the diversity of our employee base, our customer base. We've been recognized by many industries for our accomplishments. We have a long-standing supplier diversity program. We spent close to $15 million.
Sir, I appreciate that, but I don't see any African American, Latinos, Asian American, or Native American. I don't see any women here speaking up or speaking out for what they need, what they want. Our country is a very diverse country. Our forefathers and our foremothers all came to this great country in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And we should look out for each other and care for each other. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I think we agree on that point and recognize that our Democrat colleagues on the committee have an opportunity to bring witnesses to this table as well. I think it's important for us, yes, and made that choice. And I think it's important, if I may, not at this time.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield?
Yes, I will.
Mr. Chairman, the breakdown of the witnesses, which is a pretty good discussion, I think we would all agree, and it's helpful. But the breakdown of the witnesses at 4-to-1 is not representative or reflective of the proportions of representation on the committee from the two political parties.
So it is traditional to take this type of approach. My only point is this. I think it's important as we talk about middle-class workers, as we invite our witnesses here, we recognize they represent a diverse group of Americans that Mr. Lewis has championed beautifully for over the years.
Mr. Chairman, would you further yield?
Not at this time. So, Mr. Reichert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm glad you raised it.
Thank you for your testimony today. The bottom line is we're trying to create a tax code. You've all touched on all the members of the panel. That would allow job growth, create jobs, increase paychecks, grow our economy, and help hard-working Americans. We all agree that the tax code is broken. It's too complicated. So I want to touch on a question that Mr. Tiberi highlighted, and I'll also tie it back to Mr. Lewis's point, if I could. So, Mr. Peterson, you talked about the impact of our outdated code on your business, and I just would like you to elaborate just a little bit more on what an updated code would do and mean for you, and more, I think importantly, what it would mean for your employees, for the hardworking Americans that Mr. Lewis has referred to and others prior to my questioning. How is it going to impact your employees? And it's been mentioned a little bit, but if you could dive into that question for me.
Thank you, Congressman. As I described before, and let me be give a little bit more detail, we have been a company that's been around for 150 years. We've developed our products and services which create intellectual property. We don't produce tangible goods. We produce goods and services. Our intellectual property is registered and owned in the United States, principally in New York. When we export our services, we pay full taxes on those goods and services in the United States and in the New York State. Our competitors have their intellectual property and intellectual capital registered offshore, and they pay very low taxes. When they sell those products and services into the U.S., they do not pay those same taxes on their products and services. Second point, new companies that are being developed today in the last 15 or 20 years, they begin their development of their company from scratch with a tax policy. And they register their intellectual property offshore immediately. They set up the employees offshore. They put a service center in Dublin or in Luxembourg or in Singapore. They own their intellectual property offshore, and then they sell it back to the United States, and they don't pay taxes on it because the royalties go back to an offshore business. We compete against companies
For Americans today that are watching, how's this going to help them?
What it means for Americans today is if we reform this tax, a territorial tax system at a lower rate, we will invest more in the United States.
What does that mean for the American worker, investing more here in the United States?
What that means is that we will create more jobs.
Creating more jobs. Are they going to be higher paid jobs?
There are all kinds of jobs. We have jobs all the way from lower-end jobs. We need people at all different levels.
And these are not jobs just for white Americans? White, older
these are
male Americans?
Jobs for people from all over the country,
diverse
from
Americans.
all backgrounds.
Every American citizen, every American who's working in this country will benefit from this tax code. Is that correct? All of you nodding your heads?
Every American will benefit.
It's going to be good for all hardworking Americans, correct?
This is good for all hardworking Americans. Every time we start a new operation, we have to build facilities. We have to get organized in that regional section. We hire all types of workers, and it's a great benefit for the entire spectrum of U.S. workers.
Great. All of you agree? Mr. Farr, I'd like to follow up on your comments about the importance of tax reform as it relates to U.S. competitiveness and economic growth. In your view, and I know we've had lower corporate rates, permanent territorial, simplify, full expensive, comprehensive. What is in your opinion, the best thing that we can do, the most important thing we can do when it comes to tax reform?
From my perspective, the lower tax rate is the most important thing. And I know there's going to be a lot of trade-offs, pluses and minuses relative to that lower tax rate. But I think it's very, very important to have the lowest tax rate. That will help all employees.
And
Over
why
the last 10 years, we've increased our wages year by year by year, but my employee base has lost a lot from higher taxes, higher cost of benefits, and so that's eaten away. So a lower tax rate will help them.
20 seconds, the importance of permanence.
Permanence is critical because I make decisions over 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years. I don't make a decision by a quarter. It's a 10-year horizon.
You need certainty to help American workers keep their jobs, right?
That makes a big difference. That's why I'm betting and making those investments in Ohio right now, because I'm certain you're going to do it.
Great. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. This is a very troubling time in American history. Our national security has been jeopardized. Our democracy is threatened, while so many have remained silent about it. Hopefully, the appointment of a special counsel is a first step to seeking justice and to assuring Americans that our system of checks and balances is not entirely broken. The subject of today's hearing is directly related to the willingness of so many to ignore a growing tower of Trump travesties. Some see Trump as the only ticket to more tax breaks, and they're willing to pay almost any price to get them. Today is also noteworthy as the first time ever, after almost an entire year, that anyone has come forward in a public hearing anywhere to justify this self-styled Better Way tax plan. Now, I certainly favor public policies, including tax policies, that are designed to encourage entrepreneurship and grow jobs here in America. And we know what some of those public policies are, that if we invest in our workforce, where there are growing workforce shortages, in education and job training for jobs that are going unfilled, we can become more competitive. Those are the very programs that President Trump proposes to slash. We know that if we have a competitive infrastructure, instead of trucks backed up on our highways and trains on outdated systems like our competitors in Europe and Asia, we can be more competitive and grow our economy. But some of those are programs that President Trump proposes to cut, and the rest are the ones that he's never gotten around to making a proposal on. And of course, the best way to grow our economy at the least cost is comprehensive immigration reform, according to economists and business groups across the spectrum. But that doesn't fit the ideological structure of this administration. As for tax policies, well, apparently our tax code is outdated. It's full of loopholes. It doesn't work very well. But the witnesses that are before us today are from companies that seem to have done pretty well under that system. And they tell us today that if they pay less or no taxes every time they invest $1 at home, they'll begin investing more at home. While I question the logic of that, I think they offer many valuable insights, a number of which I agree with. I think that we need a tax policy that encourages jobs at home. And when the chairman of our committee tells us there are proven ways to grow our economy, I think what these hearings have to be about is to show us the proof that this particular Better Way tax plan will actually grow jobs. And that proof has to come from some people who come before this committee who are not telling us basically that they think giving themselves a tax break is a good thing, because I think everybody will agree to that kind of conclusion. As far as what's been testified to here today, we do need a tax rate for corporations that is lower than it is today. Of course, if we lower the tax rate into the 20 percentile, that will be much more than many corporations are actually paying today. We need comprehensive tax reform that involves trade-offs. The tax code is replete with tax loopholes, but we don't have really a list of tax loopholes that would be closed today, only vague talk of trade-offs. And certainly we don't just need tax cuts, we need comprehensive reform. This is not the first tax cut that this committee has considered. We've already approved in the House an almost $1 trillion tax cut that will provide most of its benefits to the super rich and a few corporate interests like the pharmaceutical industry. Before his confirmation, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin promised that there would be no absolute tax cut for the upper class. But the one page, I guess it's shorter than a grocery list, that has been presented more recently by Mr. Mnuchin is chock full of candy for those at the top and very vague promises for the middle class. One analysis of it suggests that the top 400 taxpayers will get $15 million each. We need to be working on a comprehensive tax reform that provides benefits to the middle class and that does not raise the national debt. The committee has said that's their position. That has not been Mr. Trump's position. And coming together on that will be critical as we move forward.
All time has expired. Thank you. Mr. Roskin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My friend from Texas just argued essentially that we needed a lower tax rate and then implicitly criticizes the people that are coming advocating for a lower tax rate. But I digress. There's an old phrase that says this, that when the bulls fight, the grass loses. So who loses as we dither under the current tax code? The wealthy are not suffering today. Wealthy are doing well. It's the folks who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum who suffer if we wring our hands and lose a once-in-a-generation opportunity by pursuing a perfect tax code, which is a complete illusion. Perfect tax code is the unicorn of 2017. What we want is a good tax code. What we want is a tax code that Mr. Lewis can celebrate when he says, let's get it right. Okay, let's get it right. So one of the things that we need to discuss and really litigate, publicly understand what it means to get it right, two of you, Mr. Modell and Mr. Farr, mentioned in your testimony, and I'm interested in exploring this, what is the value of permanence? What's the value of permanence? So we often talk in terms of, renting things versus buying things. We put a premium on owning something. And it would seem to me that there's a real premium on permanence. All of you have been exposed in terms of marketplaces and so forth. So, Mr. Stevens, let's start with you. A permanent tax policy versus a temporary tax policy. And put this in the context of all the anxiety that we feel in the debate around this place where we have these tax extenders and temporary policy that fade off in 24, 36, 48, pick it, a number of months. What is the value to you? And then further on down the line, because you told Mr. Reichert what happens down completely throughout the whole chain, how important is permanence? You got a minute on it?
Permanence is extremely important. The ability to look out, not as Mr. Farr said, a quarter or a year, but looking out 3 and 5 and 10-year plans, particularly in the investments that a company like ours make that are in infrastructure investments that provide benefits over, literally over decades. And so having that ability of permanence, knowing what the rules are, tell us what the rules are, but then we will abide by them. But knowing that and having that allows us to make consistent, significant material capital investments that allow for the demand for jobs, demand on our suppliers, and quite frankly, with the demand on those jobs, as you put more demand for more labor, wages go up. It's simple supply and demand. It's a consistent, it's a cycle that continues to repeat itself as they come back and buy more mobile services, as they buy more.
Thanks.
It is very important to have consistency and permanence with regard to the rules.
Mr. Modell?
Yes, well, I can't speak enough about permanence. Businesses vote with their feet, right? You have to answer to your constituents. Most of them have a job at a business. The business doesn't vote. It just leaves and takes its jobs. And, you talked about the success of businesses. I've been fighting for my life, my business, for the past decade as my customers keep leaving this country. I get one industry figured out and we're doing great with them, and then they leave. And now I've got to find another and another. And it's been a tough battle for the last decade or longer. So I think a permanent tax code is so important to get my customers back in this country buying product from businesses like mine.
Mr. Farr, what would it mean for you and Emerson Electric if this Congress were to give a tax code that, that you could rely on beyond a decade? So
it means a lot to us because we make investments. The new facility we're putting in Ohio, we're replacing the facility that was built in the 60s. So we're making a facility investment of $100 million that's going to last for 20 and 30 years. I have the world to invest in, and I have the choice to look at who offers the best incentives, who gives the most consistent tax rates. And from that perspective, I look at this world. If you do a short-term, one-time accelerated depreciation impact, you'll have a surge 1 year of capital, then it dies. That is not a long-term strategy relative to investing, and that's why, from my perspective, I need to think about 2, 3, 4 years. I'm thinking about capital investments right now, 3 years out, and where I'm going to put that money. Where am I going to build that next facility for $100 million, $200 million? That's why I need permanent tax rate, and I need it for at least 10 years for my thought process.
Mr. Peterson, just quickly.
Permanence creates certainty. Certainty reduces risk.
Mr. Ratner, even quicker.
I agree.
Amen to that. I yield back.
And you got in under the wire. Well done. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here. I'm glad that we're looking at doing comprehensive tax reform. I think it's extremely important. And this morning I was just making some notes to myself, the things that I think are real important. And number one is comprehensive reform. And that's what this bill needs to be, not simply a tax cut bill. If we do a tax cut bill and we ignore the reform, we lose and the American people lose. I think it needs to be paid for. And I think all of the witnesses recognize the importance of that. But I think we need to pay for it in real terms, not just with there needs to be trade-offs. We need to specifically pay for this. We can't add to our national debt. And I think it's important that it's bipartisan. Big things that happen in Congress aren't good unless they're bipartisan, and we've all experienced what happens when we try and do it some other way. And we need to make sure, as a lot of my colleagues have already mentioned, that we really focus in on the middle class. That is extremely important. And then I added one bullet to my notes when I heard you, Mr. Model, speak, and you mentioned the desire to lower the payroll tax. I wrote down that it shouldn't hurt the middle class. And I think we need to remember that the payroll tax is how we finance Social Security. And unless you've got some way, or the committee has some way, to ensure that Social Security stays strong, if we do tax reform that takes away the funding for Social Security, that hurts all of our constituents. And I would hope that we all recognize how important the Social Security system is for all Americans. You know, the middle class have been struggling. Incomes haven't kept up with expenses. We all know that. I reference a recent study that was done by the University of Minnesota, the University of Chicago, Princeton, the federal government. And they found that a 27-year-old man today is making 31% less than he would have made in 1969. And they go on to say that he's unlikely to make up the difference in his lifetime. So as we turn to tax reform, we really have to focus on those middle-class folks. These numbers don't jive, and especially if you juxtapose that with some of the numbers that many of our corporate leaders are bringing home. It's not equitable, it's not fair, and it needs to be addressed in our bill. And tax cuts that are not tax reform are wrong. And tax cuts that aren't paid for themselves or that aren't paid for don't generate this panacea that some think that it does. We know from the 80s, we know from the early 2000s, and we know what's happening right now in Kansas, that tax cuts don't automatically pay for themselves, and we have to recognize that. Mr. Ratner, I have a question for you. Can you explain how these large increases to the debt, even for policy that we might otherwise all agree that is good policy, can become a drag on the economy as a whole?
Sure. There have been many, many studies of this done, that as the size of the federal debt goes up and the interest burden on the federal government goes up and the crowding out of private capital occurs because interest rates rise as the federal government borrows more and more, all of that is absolutely a drag on economic growth in this country. It seems like the whole panel agrees that whatever this committee does on taxes needs to take account of its impact on the deficit. And that's where, honestly, I have a little bit of a problem with what I've been hearing, because I hear we'd like to do this, this, and this, but I haven't really heard how we're going to pay for all that. And the second thing, if I could just make one other comment, that I was struck by Congressman Doggett's comment. I think that we're looking at this a little bit in isolation. Of course, as I said in my opening remarks, if you cut depreciation, there'll be more investment. How much more, we don't know. Will it be enough to pay for it, or will it justify it? We don't know. But we also really need to think about this compared to other ways we could spend, in effect, spend this money. Would the money be better spent on infrastructure? Would it be better spent on job training? Would it be better spent on education? Because the amount of money the federal government has for any of these things is limited, and we need to make sure it's spent effectively and look at it across the entire continuum.
Mr. Ratner, can you just further explain, if we cut taxes for the rich and for corporations, and we pay for that by adding to the national debt, what does that mean to the middle-class families that we represent?
Well, first of all, it's a matter of immediate fairness, that you'll be giving a benefit to the upper class and to business, and very little, as I said earlier, to the middle class. But secondly, we do, as I said in my testimony, have a problem of rising debt, and the middle class will simply have to end up bearing a greater burden of paying for that somewhere down the road in the form of higher taxes if we don't keep our debt under control at this point.
So it costs them money.
Thank you.
It's going to eventually cost them money.
Very much. All time has expired. Mr. Buchanan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses. All of us have a diverse background that come on this committee. I was in business for 30 years, built two pretty good-sized companies. I did want to touch on, I think we all agree we need to be more competitive on the corporate rate, but I want to touch on pass-through entities and make sure they don't get lost in the mix. You know, I've got a bill that I'd like to see close to parity. When you look at corporate rates at 35, they're not competitive, but on pass-throughs, it's high as 44. If you had state income tax in states like California, another 12, 13%, it could be 57%. Makes absolutely no sense. So I guess I'd like to ask some of the panelists just your thoughts on lowering those rates where they're more competitive, getting it down to somewhat near the corporate rate. I don't necessarily agree with 15%, but the difference that would make in terms of growth, in terms of jobs, and also in terms of raising wages. So I'll start with the gentleman, Mr. Model.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The pass-through issue is big, you know, and I think right now a lot of them are paying around 44%. And so, you know, if we go to 20, 25, you know, I think it's just important that it gets lower and closer to the corporate rate, that they're more similar and not so dissimilar and not so penalizing to the small business. But, you know, of course, on jobs, you know, the more we can invest, the more we can grow, the more we can hire. You know, I'm involved in some training programs in the Chicagoland area, bringing folks out of the inner city, training them for good jobs, and we need this kind of growth. We need this kind of opportunity, and I think if you do the tax reform, you will see that.
And one of the things that's always concerning to me, especially on pass-throughs, a lot of people think maybe you've got 150 employees, you happen to make $800,000. The owners don't take all that money out. They might take $150 out. The balance of the money goes in to grow and expand the business. Mr. Farr, you represent a large industry. A lot of these entities are pass-through entities, subchapter S, LLCs. What's your thoughts by the fact that they can keep a little bit more what they earn in the business? What difference is that going to make from your experience?
It makes a big difference. We have 30,000 people in the United States, across all the states, both Democrat, Republican, plants everywhere. We're very small business oriented, and we use small businesses to supply to us. If they're not healthy, they don't have the money to invest, they're not going to have the most productive equipment, their technology, their quality, and they'll lose business as we take it elsewhere. So the small business tax rate needs to come down and be closer to the corporate tax rate so they have more money to invest to support us as we grow. And that's been one of the big issues the last couple of years. They've not had the money to invest to keep up with us, so we're moving and looking for other people to supply us. And that's a big issue for these people. And I also want to agree that, you know, make a comment that we employ not only high-priced people, we probably employ low-priced people. We have all different levels of people employed across this company.
Well, I know in the state of Florida, I think 93% of the enterprises are pass-through type entities. Mr. Stevens, would you like to add to that?
I think, quite frankly, the competitiveness issue applies across the board. High tax rates makes them less competitive, gives them less money to invest, gives them less opportunity to generate jobs. All that is good for the overall economy, and for a large company, it's good for the small business vendors, suppliers, and customers to be very healthy.
Yeah, there's actually something out, I think, in the last 10 years or lately, we've got more businesses closing than opening. So we've got to have a tax code that doesn't penalize people. Mr. Ratner, would you like to add, I would, again, if you disagree with it, my thought is it's 44%, can be up to 44 for a lot of pass-throughs. And if you put state income tax to New York, or I'm sure Illinois has got a substantial tax, it's a big number. What's your thoughts?
Respectfully, Congressman, I'd make a couple of other points. Certainly, look, lower taxes are good for everybody if we can find a way to pay for it and if it can be fair. But with respect to pass-throughs, let's remember a couple of things. First, they chose to become pass-throughs. They could have become subchapter C corporations, but they felt that being a pass-through with a single level of tax was advantageous. Secondly, while by number, the pass-throughs are vastly small businesses, in terms of where the income is generated, I've seen studies that between 40 and 50% of the income is actually generated by either larger businesses or very wealthy individuals. I can tell you anecdotally that I have many friends in the hedge fund world, in the private equity world, in the investment management world who are structured as pass-throughs for the reasons I said, and they certainly do not need a tax cut or deserve one. So I think while I'm sympathetic to the genuine pass-throughs, I think the devil will be in the details of you structuring something that actually helps the people who need help without benefiting a lot of rich people.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, just real quick.
What I'd add is that it also makes these businesses much more attractive from a credit point of view. Small banks providing credit to small businesses is critical, and that kind of cash being able and capital in the business, it helps that very much as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses as well for your expert testimony. As Rich Neal has spoken, we're very concerned about what's happening to the middle class. As the chairman points out, this is a generational opportunity for all of us. And as Mr. Roscom said, so we want to make sure that we get this right. In fact, the last time generationally we took this up, and if you look out into the audience, it was labeled by one author, The Battle at Gucci Gulch. And we don't want to see a return to that. And so my first question, I have two, relates to all of you. And that's a commitment. Our most recent history in the committee with respect to a major reform had to deal with health care. And we believe on this side strongly that we need to return to regular order and that we need to have witnesses like you and an open process throughout where both sides actually participate in the drafting. Because I think, as many people have pointed out, without that, we're not going to get the permanency or the long-term consistency that you would like. And so I'd ask you, all of you, and if you give just a yes or no answer, would you be in favor of more hearings open where we get in this arena of the vitality of ideas where we can exchange and work through these, or do you think that this should end up in some closed-door process? I think it's a pretty easy answer. Mr. Stevens, we'll start with you.
Respectfully, Congressman, my expertise is in taxes and financial matters, so I'll respectfully leave that to those to talk about the healthcare process separately.
But given that's your expertise, wouldn't you like to see the open exchange of ideas?
I would hope that that is going on today, and everyone appreciates open ideas.
Don't you think we need more of that? It is going on today. Mr. Model?
Mr. Larson, I couldn't agree with you more. More information is always better, but I hope that is what we're having today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Farr?
I like more dialogue. Hopefully I don't have to be another panel and be harassed, but that's okay. Thank you.
Well, hopefully you don't consider this harassment, but I do think it's important.
It's special love. Let's put it that way. Special love.
Mr. Peterson?
I'm very pleased that today you've opened a process of starting hearings. I think getting more and more data and analytics out about the impact of the different tax proposals is critical, and how you do that is also valuable to have more transparency on the process.
Mr. Ratner, let me give you a special thanks, not only as others have mentioned with respect to the automobile industry, but your charts and graphs, which have been very illustrative in town halls that I've had. And in your arguments, because I can anticipate that you would also be in agreement about the openness, you did say in your remarks, and you mentioned three things that if you could in the short time that you have dwell on. One of them, you talked about how excessively narrow this proposal was, and if you could elaborate on that. The other was you said the need for this to be more holistic. And as in the embrace with a number of the questions from Mr. Lewis to Mr. Thompson about making sure that this is the code has got to be more distributionally neutral.
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, I think those 3 points are all interrelated in the sense that I think that to simply focus on 1 or 2 provisions affecting business as the centerpiece of tax reform is excessively narrow. And that, as I said a few minutes ago, I think that the committee should be, and I think this gets to your point about openness, I think having more hearings would be great. And to Congressman Lewis's point, hearing from a wider variety of people would be great. We're all 5, we may not agree on everything, but we're all businessmen. And there are a lot of other people out there who will have useful views for you as you think about this. But I do think you have to, I think each of these provisions or pieces of this are just a piece. And I think that as part of the effort, if I were in your shoes, I would be trying to balance, look across the whole spectrum of tax possibilities and things that are within the jurisdiction of this committee and come up with a package that is balanced and fair, and that in its entirety addresses the issues we've talked about, which are the complexity and the loopholes in the tax code, the disincentives, and the fairness issues.
And that's why you said in its current form it's excessively narrow.
It's excessively narrow.
And any thoughts on expanding that beyond, and I commend the chairman, and I know the people on the other side of the aisle want to get to this. There's broad agreement, but I think, and we had great precedent set by Dave Camp, which I know people on both sides of the aisle admire his work. I think if we're able to sit down in that matter and this exchange of ideas and providing as much love as Mr. Farr would like, that we are able to create an opportunity to move the country forward.
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Smith, you're recognized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses here today. I think this is an important discussion, important conversation that we have. I appreciate the perspectives that you bring, multiple perspectives, I will add. And I think this panel represents multiple perspectives as well. I think that as we sift through this, I hear from Nebraskans as a representative of rural and remote Nebraska, there's a frustration that, perhaps just waiting and to punt perhaps is not the solution, whether it's fixing our healthcare system, whether it's reforming our tax code. There is an understanding that, and I would say a bipartisan understanding and even consensus, that our country is uncompetitive in the world as it relates to our tax policy. I think it is very important that we come to that realization and move on it in a permanent way, as we've already heard. I know that I hear from constituents who find the death tax, for example, an unfair tax, inherently unfair, double taxation. And there seems to be an idea in Washington that, well, if you narrow that down to few enough people, then that makes it fair. I disagree with that. There will still be people harmed, individuals harmed, certainly family businesses harmed. And I think of family businesses, particularly in agriculture, that are not awash in cash and liquidity. And I would imagine there are many family-owned businesses that would fall into that category as well. So I think if we focus enough on doing the right thing for the right reasons, we can get this done. But I can tell you it can frustrate me when I hear various arguments of why not to do it that I don't think are certainly as important of reasons why we need to do this, move forward, involve as many people as we can, and that's what we have been doing. I know the working groups that we've had over time have been instructive. I speak personally on that front of how instructive that was to hear people out in various sectors of our economy. So I'm anxious to move forward here. And I think that this time and this conversation is important. I'm wondering if our panelists could perhaps explain to me, I know that Emerson points to Ohio for some expansions. We have facilities in Nebraska, not in my district, that aren't necessarily headquarters for large companies, but we have manufacturing plants. We have various locations of larger companies, perhaps. I was wondering if our panelists, in terms of manufacturing or services, could elaborate on what tax reform might do for individual locations, satellite locations or facilities and their employees around the country, perhaps starting with Mr. Stevens.
I'll give you just a personal experience. I sit on the Chamber of Commerce in Dallas, and what we're seeing is an extensive number of businesses moving into Texas because of the a favorable income tax rate compared to other states. So what we are talking about here today from a federal policy is happening every day amongst our states. So I would suggest to you that this overall tax reform, bringing down the top tax rate, providing an incentive for investment, will generate jobs across the country, as it will allow all states to be much more competitive with their foreign competitors as they exist today.
I'm from Illinois, and we have a unique example in Illinois, some budget issues there, and businesses are leaving our state as a result of it, and they're concerned. So I think it speaks to, it's a great example that when you do tax reform, that, you know, if we can get it done in the U.S., you will bring businesses all back to the U.S., to all states. You know, I wanted to make a comment. There was a comment made about switching our tax structure. You know, I'd love to do that. It would trigger a huge tax liability to do that. We have a C Corp, an S Corp, two S Corps, LLC. I'd love to get them all aligned so we could even have the fiscal year end on the same date, but to do that, I'd trigger a tax liability for cash that I don't have. And there was a comment made, you know, we've had to pay taxes some years. We've triggered a tax liability in unusual years where we didn't really make a profit, but we triggered a tax liability. And these are these crazy quirks in the code that we really need to address, and it's particularly onerous on small business.
So my comment is, as I look at AT&T, if they increase their investment, increase their infrastructure of the internet and the uses that we use over the technology of their services, that will increase my investments in those particular areas. So as they invest in Texas, I invest in Texas. If they invest in Minneapolis, I invest in Minnesota. So from my perspective, what I look at is the tax structures of each state. When I go to Illinois right now, I get concerned about the health of Illinois right now. So as I look at the various states and where I want to invest, it's around the policies relative to the state, the tax structures, the benefit of the local governments, and how they help and work with you. And so that's why we make those investments. But it also pays off of what AT&T does or what we do. We help each other for those infrastructure investments.
Mr. Peterson.
At the base of your question is about the competitiveness of the U.S. economy. We have the best university system. We have the most innovative people in the world. We have a rule of law. We have an energy boom, which attracts many new companies around the world looking at that competitive advantage. But we have a tax system that disadvantages us. Each state obviously has their own competitive advantages, and they're clearly going to be looking at that. But there's so many different advantages we have today, but we lose out on many of them because of the broken tax system.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Peterson, you talked about many of the advantages we have in the United States in terms of our economy. I'm struck that when we were talking about the various infrastructure investments, one of the problems we have is we have a country that's falling apart and we're falling behind. Those of you who are involved in the international economy realize in terms of roads, transit, air investments, the United States is sadly lacking. We just had another report from the American Society of Civil Engineers that suggests that in 5 years we haven't improved the ratings of all the things, that just the price tag got higher. In the past, we've approached both the previous administration and previous proposals for tax reform had a little bit of infrastructure stuck in. Or some people think repatriation can be sweetened by maybe moving that back into our woefully inadequate infrastructure spending. There's admittedly a little disagreement about repatriated dollars and who benefits, and some people think they have different ideas for it. But one of the things, and Mr. Farr, I would start with you because Governor Engler and the National Association of Manufacturers supported legislation I had to finally raise the gas tax after 24 years, which wouldn't add to the deficit, which would put millions of people to work from coast to coast, creating jobs in every single state, every single city, and maybe we'd be in the process of learning how to legislate again, do this, kind of build those, flex those legislative muscles. We could have panels like this for a week and listen to the president of the AFL-CIO, the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the president of the contractors, governors. South Carolina, where the legislature just overrode a veto of their governor for raising the gas tax, joining 23 other states that figured out how to do this, which we used to do on a bipartisan basis. Now, I would start with you, Mr. Farr. Do you think there would be any advantage to maybe our taking a little simple tax that anybody could understand, and in fact, it could be even shorter than the president's tax proposal, that would get the $1 trillion that he wants to spend, and that the Senate Democrats agree on that number, and get started?
As a manufacturer in the United States and I manufacture across this country, I have three things. I'd like to simplify our tax structure to make it more competitive globally. Infrastructure investment is critical. We move stuff by roads, by rails, by ports, by airports. We've been pushing this for many, many years, and we've not gotten it done. We clearly need to find the investments. You'll find very few CEOs of companies in the United States that would not say, find the money to invest in infrastructure. And I think those three things around regulation, around infrastructure, around tax policies to make this country competitive. We compete with all those things hurting us today. Yeah. We could be better.
Yeah. And my question was, do you still support raising the gas tax?
We still support finding the funds to pay for infrastructure. I mean, I can't...
Mr. Ratner, do you have an answer to that?
I certainly support raising the gas tax, and I was like in the car business for a little while. Look, I think the gas tax hasn't been raised in decades. I think that's
24 years.
Yeah. And you've made all the right points, Congressman. And I think as a matter of both infrastructure policy and energy policy, it is crazy for us to have a gas tax at this level and to allow our infrastructure to deteriorate.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your courtesy having this hearing. I appreciate our panelists raising important issues. I would respectfully suggest that the committee think about a simple subject that we could deal with. Have 3 or 4 days of listening to experts who are in local government, state government, the various industries. Hear from UPS that they lose $50 million for each 5 minutes delay in traffic. Invite in some of the Republican legislators from the 23 states that have raised the gas tax to find out why they did it in Wyoming or South Carolina. I think this is an area that we could actually find bipartisan agreement. We could actually do something, not increase the deficit. Just having a week's hearing from the Trucking Association and AAA. Why do these people agree raise our taxes? I think it'd be good for the committee. I think it would be good for the country. And who knows, this might be something we could break the logjam, do something to jumpstart the economy, and that would help ease some of the other issues that we're talking about, because it would certainly increase productivity, and it might be fun. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Jenkins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very informative hearing, and I thank all of you on the panel for giving us your time today. Mr. Model, I know you're from Illinois, but when I was hearing your testimony, I felt like I could be listening to a story of a small business owner in any small town in my congressional district in Kansas. You just mentioned, in response to my seatmate's question, that for tax purposes, your company that simply employs about 80 people has divided the company into 1 C corporation, 2 S corporations, and an LLC. And as a CPA who did tax planning, I would just want to applaud you for the creativity for your back office folks and your tax team. However, I think it begs the question, should our tax code be so administratively complicated that a business like yours should have to engage in so much work in order to achieve just a workable tax rate at the expense of simply growing your business? And to be more pointed, would you trade this highly complex system full of loopholes and surprises at every turn for the certainty of permanent, modern, simple, and a fairer tax system that allows you to grow your business?
Well, thank you for that question. I couldn't appreciate it more. Like I said, the reason we have those complex structures, and yes, in some cases it works for us, in other cases it's hindering us, and I cannot change it. I've inherited this. We're a 100-year-old business, right? The C Corp came from the 70s, the S Corps came from the 90s, and they were all done during the times there was tax changes going on all the time and reasons to do these things. But I'd love to simplify it. Like I said, I'd love to have one fiscal year end, but I would trigger, I'm a 100-year-old company. We have retained earnings on the balance sheet, not necessarily cash, but it would trigger a huge tax liability to do that. In fact, I'm also, in the business I'm here talking today, we talked about women and minorities. My sisters both help me run the business, and really we would like to transfer ownership to myself and my sisters, so we would become a woman-owned business. In order to do that, we would trigger, again, a huge tax liability. So we can't afford to do this. I'd love to make these changes. So I would trade in a second all this mess, all this complexity, and all the time we spend on it for a simple, reduced system. And again, businesses are not opposed to paying taxes. The transportation tax is a great example. I think consumption taxes is an important focus. Why are we taxing income? We want income. Let's tax other things. You should tax the things you don't necessarily want to have, not the things you do want to have. Thank you, ma'am.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe for some of the rest of you, I think it's been reported that American businesses spend about 3 billion hours and $150 billion complying with this outdated, burdensome tax code that's on the books. Could each of you just comment quickly about the cost associated with filing your returns and about the opportunity cost? What does it mean to your business to lose that kind of time and resources? Mr. Stevens?
So to put it in reference, our shareholders put up about $240 billion of capital for us to run the company, and they get about $12 billion, or about $2 a share in dividends. And we pay about $4 a share, or $24 billion in taxes in the United States every year. It's a number that's disclosed in our annual report. So our shareholders get half of what federal, state, and local governments do here in the United States, even though they're putting up all the capital for the business. We have about 300 people who work full-time in our tax department. We have a budget of about $100 million a year for that tax department, and we file over 250,000 tax returns in the U.S. So it's an extremely complex system that causes a diversion of funds that would otherwise be available to invest into complying, and we take pride in our compliance, in complying with the law.
Thank you. Mr. Farr?
I don't have the specific numbers, but I know how many people operate doing these taxes, and we have hundreds of people in the United States and around the world operating to fill out the tax reforms and compliances and making sure we're doing it right. And therefore, as I said earlier, I'd love to take that money and reinvest it in another part of the company. I mean, from my perspective, what we look at is we're trying to invest to grow, and I have to allocate those resources. One of the allocations is tax compliance and paying the taxes and all the forms we fill out. So clearly, you could take that and put it somewhere out and invest it in the company for growth or technology for new products. So it's a huge burden for us and something we have to do by law. And I sign it by law.
Okay.
Thank you. Time has expired. Mr. Kind, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony today. Very helpful. And hopefully, Mr. Chairman, this will be the one of many hearings that we have moving forward on the complexity of taking a serious run at this code, and the first time in over 30 years. But first, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Ratner, let me start with you. I don't think you had an opportunity to answer Mr. Levin's question about whether you think it's important for us, if we do take a run at comprehensive reform, that we do it in a fiscally responsible manner, that we look at certain expenditures that we can close down in order to help pay for a simplification and a lowering of rates at the end of the day. Mr. Peterson?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm looking at now at the different tax plans in a way that as you work through them yourselves, you will find ways to ensure that we can pay for them, that they're, in addition to being permanent and comprehensive, that they're also fair, and find a way to ensure that we have pay for us through them.
Right. Mr. Ratner?
Yes, I think I've made clear my view about the fact that we should not have a tax proposal or a tax bill that increases the deficit when it's scored using conventional means. We can have a debate about dynamic scoring, but I would not want to see that be part of the equation to come up with a tax plan that doesn't increase the deficit.
Yeah, you know, there's, I think, great consensus in Congress and perhaps throughout the nation that it's long past due for us to take a run at the code, over 30 years, because it's antiquated, it's outdated, it's too complicated. It's less competitive right now. The compliance costs are ridiculous, and this is an opportunity for us to do it. My fear, quite frankly, though, as we approach this is the easy default position when we get into the complexities and how difficult the trade-offs have to be made, is the Congress oftentimes lapse at the end of the year with the need to try to get something done to just cut rates, don't pay for it, declare victory, go home. If that's where we ultimately end down on this, what would each of you think? Would that be a success for this Congress or a failure or missed opportunity? Mr. Stevens?
A comprehensive plan that lowers rates and encourages investment would be a win with a prudent trade-off for all financial considerations. That would be a win, yes.
Yeah, Mr. Mott, again, if we end up, though, just cutting rates, not paying for it, declaring victory, is that success or a missed opportunity in your mind?
I agree with you, Mr. Kind, and again, that's why I'm proposing that we also do a goods and services or some other type of border adjustable VAT tax. That's how you pay for it. You broaden your base. And again, I'm proposing this offsetting credit on the people's income taxes that they pay on their wages. It's 15% for the average American worker that they pay in federal taxes. And I know there's some concern about Social Security. You know, the first year that it's on the bottom of the statement, I read it every year. The first year that there's not going to be enough funds to pay benefits is the first year I'm eligible for benefits. So I share your concern about funding Social Security, right. And that's why my proposal is an offsetting credit. You keep the Social Security taxes on the payroll, and those go into a bucket. But from another bucket, from the goods and services tax, there's a plus, there's a credit. So you protect that dedicated cash flow that's so important for Social Security.
I appreciate it. Let me just move on with another question, though, since I'm running out of time. One way of building bipartisan support, I think, in this place, is something that Mr. Blumenauer touched upon, is tying tax reform into a major infrastructure reinvestment plan. As one of the leaders in the New Dem coalition in this House, we're 61 strong right now. Just yesterday, we sent a letter to President Trump asking him to consider approaching tax reform with a tie-in with infrastructure investment. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to have our letter submitted for the record at this time.
Without objection.
And Mr. Ratner, I know you haven't been the biggest fan of deemed repatriation in the past, but we do have a ton of money that's parked overseas, not being utilized or being used efficiently. And one of the ideas that we've been focusing on within the New Dem coalition is having a fixed rate deemed repatriation dedicated for infrastructure as part of the revenue stream that we need to get going on this. Do you have any opinion about that?
Sure. I have not been the biggest fan of deemed repatriation because the evidence doesn't suggest it would make much of a difference. We tried it in 2004. It didn't really make a difference. There's a lot of cash on companies' balance sheets here now that they're not investing. But in return for getting critical money for infrastructure, I would support either deemed repatriation or actual repatriation tax if that money were channeled to a useful purpose, simply to be able to get going on the infrastructure issues.
Yeah, yes, Mr. Farr?
I think the reason why they didn't have much impact is a one-time impact. It goes back to permanence. And so I fundamentally believe if you have a policy, just like our European policy is, so everyone brings the money back, you pay a simple tax on that, that money will come back in the United States and it will be invested in the United States. And from my perspective, having that money here is a good thing.
Hopefully we'll end up at the end of this process with a much more simplified, more competitive tax code, but also fair, for working families, for my small businesses, family farmers back home too, and that's the goal, at least, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Paulson. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank also all of the testifiers today. This has actually been very enlightening testimony. Look, from my perspective, I continuously hear from Minnesota companies about the importance of having major tax reform that is permanent, that promotes investment, that lowers rates, and it'll boost paychecks, it'll increase jobs, it'll help the economy. I hear that all the time. We know the larger companies that I have in my area. It's the 3Ms of the world, the General Mills, the Cargills, the larger institutions that employ so many people. But it's also these small businesses, these Main Street businesses that people have never heard of, but they are so important as the engine of the economy. I think of Steinwell Company, which is a plastic injection manufacturer that I recently had a chance to tour in my district, or the Baldinger Bakery that I had a chance to tour and visit that produces the buns for McDonald's, looking for a more simplified tax code, or even the recent example of a letter I received from Dawn, a small business owner in Loretto, Minnesota, who writes in saying, we have a once-in-a-lifetime generation window of opportunity to unleash a strong economy and to repair and simplify a tax code that is helping hold back our small business economy right now. And what I think is really striking about these messages and what you shared today is there is an acknowledgement that all of our job creators, both big and small, are in this together. And so simply put, regardless of whether you work at a large or a small company, these businesses and the men and women who are working alongside them each day will benefit from fixing a broken tax code. We're talking about lowering the rates, having permanent reforms so we can plow more money into their paychecks and more money into their investments and higher wages. And so, Mr. Stevens, you had mentioned right off the bat, this is about unleashing economic growth. It's a key driver in investment. Mr. Model, you had mentioned 3 different types of tax filings you have to do, and it's important to level the playing field. And Mr. Farr, you've talked about the importance of manufacturing, with 2/3 of manufacturers particularly paying under that high individual tax rate. I'll just start here, and we've all shared the perspective already, but it is well documented, Mr. Stevens, that our current high corporate income tax rate severely does reduce domestic investment and entrepreneurship as well. And how would new investments made as a result of a 20% rate affect communities? How would that help communities? What might it mean to the local suppliers, again, which I think Mr. Farr talked about, the contractors, the vendors that you partner with in your operations? Or more importantly, what might that 20% rate mean for those individuals that you currently employ or might look to hire in the future?
So thank you for the question. Quite frankly, it would have a very direct, immediate, positive effect on our vendors, on our suppliers, and quite frankly, on our employees. As you put more dollars to work in capital investments, you generate demand for jobs. You generate demand for technical work in engineering, design, architectural work. You put to work demands on research for new technologies and new services. All of those items would be have additional demand so that the supply that is out there would go to work. So more people would go to work, and in the cases of many of the people, their wages would go up because there's more demand for their services. This then would start that cycle that comes back to demand for our services, demand for mobile phone services, television services, broadband services, so it has a virtuous cycle. But by the same token, I think this is really important. State and local governments would see an immediate uplift in the prosperity because it would generate jobs, it would generate payroll taxes, it would generate sales, it would generate sales taxes, it would generate investment in assets that generate property taxes. And once again, that generates additional demand for our services and other large companies' services. So it would have this cycle of continual growth. That's what's so important. As we have this extremely high rate and investments are moving offshore and they will stay there for the longer term, we are missing out on that opportunity. So acting quickly to get that done now will be an important answer.
So keeping headquarters here, keeping innovation here, lifting our economy for everyone is going to be a long-term boost with permanency, right? Mr. Model, I'll just keep going right down the line.
Yeah, just briefly, you mentioned the business in your district that makes the buns and the one that does the plastic. The purpose of those businesses is to bake the buns and to make the plastic parts. The secondary effect is hopefully they make a profit, right? And so I believe that if we help these businesses be better at what they're doing, have more capital to do that, they will invest in making more buns, making more parts. Hopefully, as an offset, they make a profit as well. But keep in mind, the primary purpose is to do what they do, and if you give them the resources to do it, they will do more of that.
Mr. Farr.
3 comments. We have 2 facilities in Eden Prairie, 1 in Shakopee, 1 in Chanhassen. We're investing right now in Shakopee. We're moving jobs back into the country. And it will help, obviously, from a technology job standpoint, it helps education, it helps employment, it helps everything around that area. So from my perspective, it really spreads out and helps the community in a big way, just like it hurts the community when we leave.
And Mr. Farr, I visited both in those facilities, and I heard the same message there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So, Mr. Pascarell, just a note to members. So after your questioning, we'll move to 2-to-1 ratio is going forward. Mr. Pascarell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I want to thank all the members of the panel. Each of you are CEOs or senior vice presidents. I want you to think about something I'm going to say now. You know what your effective tax rate is now. And I'm sure you've done the numbers. If the Ryan Brady plan becomes the law, what will your effective tax rate be? You see, we have a problem. I listened to the chairman open up this meeting today, this hearing, and I listened very carefully, as I usually do, to the chairman. He mentioned three things in his introduction. He mentioned the corporate tax rate. 10 years ago, Democrats on this committee pushed for a lowering of the corporate tax rate to 25%. Secondly, he mentioned the immediate expensing, write it off. That's the second thing that he mentioned. And the third thing he mentioned, Mr. Chairman, is that businesses are eager for tax reform. The problem in what you said, Mr. Chairman, is tax reform does not only pertain to the businesses of this country. Tax reform refers to everybody who pays in some manner, shape, or form federal taxes in some form or other. We have a problem here because in the last 30 years, we've moved, and I want Mr. Ratner to respond to this if he would, in terms of something he said before. We've moved from an even tax system of taxing assets and taxing incomes. That's not the case anymore. I believe it's somewhere in the high 30s, 30% of taxing income and down into the 20% of taxing assets. And I want Mr. Ratner to tell all of us assembled here what that actually means in terms of what someone takes home in their pocket, whether they are poor or middle class or on top of the mountain.
Well, Congressman, I think what you're referring to is that the 1986 Tax Act made taxes on investment income and taxes on earned income the same at 28%, and since then they have diverged, and they're obviously 39.6 on earned and 23.8 if you include the Obamacare tax.
Would you repeat those numbers, the final numbers, the last two numbers?
I believe it's 39.6 is the top rate on earned income and 23.8 on investment income.
What do you think of that?
I have a rather heretical view of it, and I'm actually a huge beneficiary of it because I am in the investment business, and so.
Well, all of you are.
Well, some of them are. They may actually work and earn money. I'm an investor, and so I am a substantial beneficiary of the 23.8% rate, which, as you know, the proposal is now to eliminate the 3.8 and make it 20.
That's right.
I personally think it is a mistake. I have been in business investing for 35 years. I've had tax rates, as we talked about before, at 28. I've had tax rates over 40. I've had tax rates at 15 on investment income at one point. None of it has affected by one iota how I conducted my life or my business. I see no reason why I should be paying 23.8 on my so-called unearned income, whereas I'm paying 39.6 on my earned income. I think I would actually support raising all of the taxes on unearned income as part of a way to pay for some of the things that we've been talking about today.
Mr. Chairman, I hope you listened to what he just said, because this tax reform that's put before us is phony and hypocritical. Worse, it sends the wrong message to the poor, if I'm bold to use that term here, and the middle class at the same time. What we're doing is saying to the American people, we're going to make your lives better, we're going to increase your income and your salaries, you're going to be in a better position now if we help the business community primarily. I want to help the business community, by the way, but I will not vote for tax reform that simply is directed and targeted at those who are at the engine. I want to take care of the people also that are in the back cars and maybe the caboose. And that's the problem we have in our tax system right now. Yes, we need a change, but it's got to cover everybody, period. I yield back.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Martin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here today. Mr. Stevens, your company, AT&T, has a huge facility in my district, and we appreciate the fact that Texas is the headquarters for AT&T. At the end of the day, it's going to be the job of every member of this committee to go back to its constituency and say to it, this is a major tax reform plan. Please support it and have me convince them that it is a good thing for them. Let's take a situation where you 3 or 4 companies, call your employees and call your vendors in to a big auditorium, and you get up in front of them and say, this is why the tax reform plan in the Better Way is a better thing for this company, and it's also a better thing for you as the employee or the vendor. And I would like to know how you would go about doing that. Ms. Stevens.
Congressman, we're here to support the comprehensive tax reform. We're for it because it will increase investment, and increasing investment increases jobs. And when you increase jobs, you increase wages. You give people what they care about is their net take-home pay, and it'll go up because it'll be demand, higher demand for their services. And the reason we're for it is because as those working class individuals are fully employed and employed in greater numbers, the demand for our services will grow. And if our revenue lines grow and we have to pay additional income taxes on that, we'll be glad to do it. But it's a cycle that helps everyone, as well as their local school district, as well as their local police department. It also helps those with getting broadband and other services out, because those additional investment dollars will go into those infrastructure investments, certainly for our company. So this is a benefit for all to make us more competitive with the rest of the world, because we aren't today.
Thank you. Mr. Model.
I couldn't agree more with that. You know, I was reminded that this room seals when the doors close. This is a secure room. So we're kind of in a bubble here. And I think that we're talking in general about being in a bubble. You know, the rest of the world has gotten competitive, has changed the way they do taxes. And if we don't change the way we do taxes, we are not competitive. And that's what it's about, getting the people at the back of the train on board, bringing the jobs back here, bringing the businesses back here so small businesses, large businesses can be profitable and can do it here in America. So I hope that we can do this and get globally competitive and look out of the bubble.
Agree 100% with the first two statements. I would add that I'd say, look, if we make investments around the world, if we have a competitive tax rate here in the United States, it'll increase the investment policy, our investment right here in the United States. They'll come into the calculation of making those investments right here in the United States. I also agree you can't just do business taxes, to our congressman over here. You have to do individuals. Individuals have to see a benefit from this. You can't just make this for wealthy and for business people. You have to make this across the board. This is our chance. But if we have more money from a lower tax rate as a company, we will invest more money, because our job is to grow and invest, not to collect cash, but to grow and invest, and that's what we would do.
Yes.
When I talk to our employees about the comprehensive tax reform that I know all of you are going to do, I'm going to tell them that we just got a raise. Our company just got a raise. Instead of spending $560 million a year on taxes, we're going to pay less, and what are we going to do with that? With that raise, we're going to spend it, and we're going to invest it. It's like being in a 100-yard dash, and right now we're starting 20 yards behind. We're running a 120-yard dash against the rest of the world who's running a 100-yard dash, and this is going to put us back at the start line at a 100-yard dash.
I would agree with everything that's been said before, so I won't repeat it, but I would just say this one other piece, which is I think there's enormous urgency around this. We all understand the political calendar. This is the beginning of a new administration. There's a window in which things hopefully normally get done. Then we're into midterms, then we're into re-election cycles, and the pace tends to fall off. And I think if we miss this opportunity, if we don't come together and find common ground, and all of us are willing to make compromises, we will all regret this later.
And I agree with that. And I would say to all the businesses that are listening to this, they're watching this very closely, we intend to do tax reform. It is our #1 goal. And we are going to need your help at the end of the day to communicate with your employees that this is a good thing to do. And they need to pick up the phone and call their congressman and say, please vote for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank all of our witnesses. As I've listened to a very intense, and some would probably say one-sided kind of conversation, not by intent, but you know, there's an old saying in Illinois where I come from,
It says, if you fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I've been listening to theories about trickle-down economics ever since I've been able to read and ever since I've been able to hear. And I've never found a way yet where the trickled enough to really assure that the middle class was being protected in the same way that one would expect anybody from a different class or another class trying to protect that entity. I think the information that we've heard sounds great, but it also comes from not enough diversity. It just keeps coming back to what John said earlier. And I was wondering if there were other individuals being asked the same question, what kind of answer would we get? It's kind of like asking the question, is it fair for birds to eat worms? You ask the bird, you get one answer. You ask the worm, you get a different answer. Now you've got to determine which one is right, which one is correct, whose interests are being protected, or is there a way to protect both? Is there a way to prevent there being losers and winners? Is there a way for the middle class to look at the proposals that we've seen and say, yes, this will give me the assurance that my status in life is going to be protected? And so, Mr. Ratner, let me ask you, the tax cuts, and we haven't heard much about how to pay for them, and I believe that everything that you get, you got to pay for one way or the other. But how do the middle and working classes benefit from basically the Republican tax plans and proposals that we've heard about?
Congressman, I think first, as I said earlier, in terms of direct benefit, it's de minimis. It's for an American making $50,000, a family, an average American, it would be a $1,000 tax cut compared to a $25,000 tax cut for someone in the top 1%. So there's no real meaningful direct benefit. You would have to believe that all of the business cuts that have been discussed here would have secondary and tertiary effects that would benefit those people. And I would certainly agree there would be some benefit. I think it is very, very indirect, and I think that before this committee should recommend such a package and make the contention that it helps the average American, I think a good bit more study would have to be done to actually document what we're really talking about in terms of dollars, because I think you would find that the cost of those tax cuts, which again, as we've discussed, have yet to be paid for, relative to the benefit to the average worker, may not line up properly.
Thank you.
Congressman, you and I are neighbors in Illinois, and I'm not sure if I'm the robin or the worm or maybe the dirt there underneath it all, but I would welcome you to come to my business anytime. We've hired quite a few folks out of your district. We've put them through training programs, and we are hopefully giving them that better life. I couldn't believe more in what you're talking about, and I would love you to come and ask those folks yourself. Anytime you're welcome, please.
Thank you very much, and I will look forward to doing that. We are appreciative of every effort that is made to try and help even the playing field. Thank you very much. Now yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Black, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the panelists for being here today. This is a very interesting conversation. The way I break this down is there are 4 factors that actually drive growth. One is the labor supply, the other is the physical capital, the other is human capital, and then 4th is innovation. So when we look at economic growth here in the United States, it really has been held back. It's been held back over the last several years, and part of that is because of the size and the complexity of our tax code. That's one reason. Regulations, onerous regulations that are put in place certainly do help or do work a part of holding back that success. And for years, we have seen a low labor force participation rate. I know that we'll read the newspaper and it'll say, well, unemployment's down, but we know that only about 63% of those able-bodied workers that could be in the workplace are actually in the workplace. So we've seen low participation rate, and that certainly isn't helping people at the lower or the middle income to not have that. We've seen weak capital investment. Why is it that people aren't investing so that we can see a growth in manufacturing and other industries and sectors? And essentially no wage growth. So these are pieces and parts that actually are affected by the tax code and would be affected as we make those changes. I do want to focus on, as many of the others in here have, is the real reason for this, in my opinion, is that we need to unlock the opportunity and the prosperity for the American workers. That should be the goal at the end of the day. And I know from my own experience, I'm a small business owner, that human capital is the most important part of my business enterprise, having good employees that we pay good wages to, both to help our business succeed, but also to make sure that our employees prosper. That's very important in our model, and I hear that from you all as well. And so we've got to look at ways to strengthen our people so that they have the skills and the training so they can compete and succeed in the global economy, and ultimately to enjoy the benefits of their hard work. So, Mr. Farr, I want to turn to you. Your testimony speaks to the vital role of manufacturing and what it plays in our economy. I have a lot of manufacturing in my district, and I say amen to that. What are the kinds of tax policies that create not just more manufacturing jobs, but better jobs and higher paying jobs?
I think one of the key issues I talked about is the research and development tax and benefit, because that's going to be our lifeblood of the future. And the manufacturing is changing, and we're going to have to re-educate all our workforce.
Amen.
And we're spending millions of dollars right now, because without them, we won't have a manufacturing facility. But the research and development credits are very important. American companies are very innovative. We're the most innovative in the world, and by having that ability to stay ahead of that foreign competition, it allows us to compete, even though we have the highest tax rate, some of the highest regulations, and some of the weakening infrastructure we talk about. So innovation around R&D tax credit would really make a big difference for us. Willing to give up other things, but that, from my perspective, is the lifeblood of what makes American manufacturers competitive.
And if you do better, do your employees do better?
Our employees do a lot better.
And why is that? Because you need good employees to run your business.
Because we invest in education, we invest in our employees, we invest in local education, we put the money back in.
So, Mr. Peterson, just really quickly on a similar note, you describe increasingly important role of the service sector. Are there tax policies that you have thought of that would, again, create not just more service industry jobs, but also high-quality jobs with better pay?
We would definitely look at the service industry creating high-paying American jobs for all Americans. And one of the ways that we look at this is related to the territorial system specifically. The way intellectual property and intellectual capital is developed, it can move anywhere. It's not like a manufacturing plant. Manufacturing plants take a lot more of what you talked about, physical capital as well as financial capital, to make a decision on. But it's very easy to move people and to move intellectual property. Our tax laws today incentivize people to develop intellectual property probably in the United States, but then move the ownership of it offshore. The territorial system is one that's most important to get the benefit of that intellectual property, that ownership, and the tax back in the United States.
So what I hear you saying is that as we have in our business experience, that the better we are able to do, the better we're able to treat our employees, which that boat that rises is rising for both the employer and the employees. So this tax code is here so that we can make sure that they both get married together, and that we see that the Americans all the way across the board are doing better because our tax code has released those dollars and the energy to have the economy move ahead. So thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. First of all, I would not be here today if it weren't for actions that took place in 2009 where one of the dealerships, one of our franchises, actually under the car czar, by the way, Mr. Ratner, you're not a car guy. I'm a car guy. You're a hedge fund guy. To me, a hedge fund's the guy who plants shrubs. That's what I save money for at home. Don't take that the wrong way. No, don't take that the wrong way. I mean this sincerely, because I've never done your job, you've never done mine, but I know the reason that what I'm here today is because one of my franchises was taken away because of the United States government, not because of something I did wrong. It's that simple. All of you that actually come from the private world, when I look at what's going on, and there's not one person, because all we're talking about today, is there a need for pro-growth tax reform? And without a doubt, everybody says, yes, there is. There is. It's unquestionable. Then the next thing is, so what's fair? And how do we address fairness? And how do we define fairness? And is it really the best for everybody? I've got to tell you, I've looked at this every which way we can. From death taxes, we're third generation right now. I want to see it go to a fourth generation, and I don't know that we can. And Mr. Motto, I'm with you. We're a C Corp. We're also an S Corp. That wasn't a decision we made on our own. The government helped us make it. So as we look at all these things, and when it comes to pro-growth, it better be pro-growth. I am just really concerned that a country that's going to have record revenues still can't come close to paying its spendings. You couldn't do it in your business, and none of us could do it at all. So I worry about that. And Mr. Ratner, you are concerned about deficits. I am greatly concerned. I know that when President Bush left office, it was almost $10 trillion. And when President Obama left office, it was almost $20 trillion. So the concern with that is immeasurable. I don't know how I grew that fast, but it did. Pro-growth. In your estimation of where you sit, and I know we compete globally now, so it's kind of foolish to think we can do this on our own. We have to look at the model we now exist in. All of these different items that we're talking about today, is there any of them that you disagree with as far as growing our economy and making sure that all of you folks that pay every penny, and by the way, what this government uses to run these wonderful programs comes from you? I've told the chairman many times, there's been years I have not paid a penny in taxes. It's not because I understood the tax code. It's because I didn't make any money. And one of those years was in 2009 when the annual sales rate for automobiles, by the way, went from 16 million to 9.5 million. That's a hell of a hit. So it wasn't a matter of policy at that time. It was a matter that the world was upside down. So anything that you disagree with what we're doing or what we're attempting to do, because we all agree that if you're healthy, the country's healthy. You're able to hire people, you're able to educate people, you're able to participate in your communities, and more importantly, you're able to fund every single government spend that we have out there. Anything that you disagree with, anything you say we should be doing faster other than getting this to an end.
The only thing I'd say you got to do faster is we need to get our global competitive tax rates equal to our competitors around the world. We are losing jobs every day the more we sit here with this big difference. This is a big issue. I'll tell you right now, I invest constantly around the world, and these changes are really big issues to us as a company. And if we don't get this back in line, we're going to continue to lose jobs, and we're going to fall further and further behind. This is very important to us in this country. I'm an American. I'm manufacturing American, and I live in St. Louis, Missouri.
Perfect. Yes, Mr. Stevens. Or Mr. Model, it doesn't matter. You're all doing the same thing, just on a bigger scale or a smaller scale.
Completely agree with Mr. Farskowitz. The only thing I'd add is urgency is important. And let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. We are willing to make trade-offs where we understand that there are trade-offs to be made, that there are multiple interests that have to be accounted for, and we all accept that. Please, with urgency, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Thank you. Mr. Model.
One quick thing, just how important it is to make this easy for small business, and you clearly get that. But we talked about deficits also. These other countries that are being very competitive, they're not so worried about deficits. They're worried about getting the jobs, getting the industry, and getting the stuff there. So it's a tough problem. I'm on this side, but it needs to be dealt with.
Mr. Peterson.
I'm encouraged that we've begun this process and that we're having this hearing. And this is going to be hard. But because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Mr. Ratner.
I'm a shrub, and so I don't know if shrubs are allowed to talk or not.
You and I have been together before, but I got to tell you, I wish I could have sent you the letter I got taking away a family-owned business because of somebody's whims, okay? So I don't want to get into that right now, although we are, but I am going to say this. I am reclaiming my time. Thank you all for being here, and this is the first step in you being here before. You are the revenue producers. We are the spenders. You're the producers. Thank God we're finally getting the private sector in front of us right now to let everybody in the world know how we do improve our country. So thank you for being here. We can talk later, Mr. Ratner.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding our very first hearing this Congress to discuss what I consider to be the most pressing legislative issue, and that's our severely overdue tax reform effort. And I want to echo our ranking member's statement that lasting, comprehensive tax reform means absolutely nothing if it doesn't put the middle class first. And I would really urge that this be a bipartisan effort. I continue to hope that we can work on a bipartisan package, unlike the recent healthcare reform attempt, because it's very frustrating to sit and find areas of common belief, but not have your voice or your opinions heard. And while it's impossible to highlight everything that I think should be a priority for this committee as we continue on this path towards tax reform, I'm going to try to hit on a couple of key notions. First of all, I want to reiterate a point that I've made many, many times. Tax reform needs to be comprehensive and not piecemeal. We cannot fix the code for one group of people, leaving countless others worse off because of it. We also can't cut taxes for the richest of the rich and assume that somehow that will magically grow the economy. You cannot cut your way to growth. That's been tried and it has failed miserably. My biggest fear in this process has always been a final tax reform package that puts American workers and the domestic businesses that they employ them on an even more unequal footing in our tax code. Our tax code is woefully out of date, but how we get from here to a revamped tax code really deserves some thoughtful deliberation, and we really need to roll up our sleeves and get our hands into the nitty-gritty of what is good policy. The process also requires some thoughtful feedback from those who are going to be most affected by the changes that we will eventually make, which is why I hope that we won't continue to have hearings where we only have panelists who represent a narrow set of interests. And I would love to ask the panel rhetorically, how many of you are the sole or primary caregiver for an aging parent or a dependent child? How many of you are single heads of households? How many of you struggle at the end of the month with whether or not to pay your utility bill or go buy groceries for your children? I think that those perspectives deserve their time in the sun here to have their perspectives voiced as well. When we get one narrow swath of perspectives, I don't think that that does anything good for a thoughtful and robust discussion about how tax reform should move forward in a way that is fair. I've often said that our tax code reflects our priorities as a country, and we need to create an environment for good-paying jobs to flourish and allow families to be able to save and have some financial security. You want to talk about uncertainty, many American families face an existential uncertainty from day to day, which is very different than business planning uncertainty. Now, during my time on this committee, I've been proud to work on legislation in a bipartisan fashion to try to help ease the burden of child and elder care costs, and it's my hope that the committee will consider those financial responsibilities and strains on families and the nuts and bolts of those proposals as we work to update our federal code. Beyond that, working families are only able to meet their needs at home when they're able to earn a decent wage at work. And while this panel seems to focus on the competitiveness of our countries, and I'm not taking that away, that's an important priority, I don't disagree that we shouldn't focus on how to make our companies competitive, but we also have to keep in mind, how do we help working families be successful as well? And it's not just about cutting the corporate tax rate. We need to look at what policies really help those struggling working families. Questions that working families deal with, the ability to afford quality child care or to purchase a home or to save for retirement, those should be a focus of this committee right now. Right now, we are forcing families to make impossible choices, and I believe that by highlighting those tough issues, we will force this committee to be a little bit more thoughtful in its approach to tax reform. With that, I have one question. Mr. Ratner, I want to know if you could speak to how addressing the problems that middle class and working class Americans face, how could that benefit the economic impact across the board?
I think, Congressman, that would be a huge plus because, as I've said before, there's a supply side to the economy, which is what a lot of the investment issues we've been talking about focus on, and there's a demand side. And to the extent that middle-class people have more resources, are more able to go out and buy things, then that's obviously a big plus for economic growth.
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Renacci, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here as well. It wasn't that long ago that I probably could have been sitting on the other side there with you as a businessman for almost 30 years. Mr. Ratner, I also have to say that the only reason I'm here is my profitable business, my car dealership, one of them was taken away from me during the Car Czar days. And by the way, there were 53 employees in that business that was profitable, who were hardworking, struggling Americans, like some of my colleagues want to talk about, that I had to let go when the business was shut down. So we have to remember, when government interferes, people get affected. And the tax code is affected. The one thing I want to talk to you about, I want to talk to you about another person that I represent. It's that 24-year-old that starts out his first business. He or she starts out and they don't have any money. So they borrow some money, they write off the interest, they start hiring people. They don't take a paycheck. They don't take a paycheck. And they hire those hardworking middle-class Americans. And they start to grow it, and then they have to look at their businesses. They say, wait a minute, I can't hire any more people because I've got this tax burden. So I slow down on my hiring, and I got to pay my tax burden to the federal government. So you can't grow, and you can't bring more people on. That's a business that's not represented at the panel. But the truth of it is, that's the hardworking American that needs to be talked about as well. And by the way, 34 years ago, that was me. I started my first business with nothing. I was a hardworking middle-class person, barely making ends meet, but I was able to live the American dream. And the tax code did get in the way. So the good thing about today is I heard agreement from everyone. Here's the things I heard agreement. We need to lower taxes. We need a territorial system. We need to make sure the U.S. is more competitive, and there is a cost to doing nothing in the form of businesses and jobs leaving. That is so important. Now, the burden of the tax code, as I'm aware of, corporations don't pay taxes. You all know that. Corporations pass it on. So the more taxes you pay, you're passing it on to the individual. It's a consumer. And we have to look at that because that's higher prices to the consumer. So here's what I really want to do. I want to get to the bottom of this. The real relief from the corporate rates going down will be to wage owners, consumers, and shareholders. We do have the highest tax rate in the world. And because we have the highest tax rate in the world, companies are leaving because they're not competitive. We know that. I'm hoping the American people are watching this because that's the truth. And I think all of you would agree with this. We have the highest tax rate in the world. When companies leave, we lose tax revenue. We lose tax revenue. The United States government loses tax revenue. So we have to become more competitive. The way we become more competitive in a global economy is dropping our tax rates. Would you all agree with that? You all agree? We got to lower tax rates? Good. Because that has to be the driver. We have to lower tax rates. And the disparity really between the income between these tax rates is what's driving us. So tell me, would you all agree, because I want top end now. We can get into the weeds later. But in top end, you all would agree we have to lower our tax rates? Every one of you? You all would agree that we need to have a territorial system. You all would agree that the U.S. has to become more competitive with a lower tax rate. You agree? And you all agree that we can't do nothing. So, I mean, we do have some agreement here, bipartisan agreement, which is great. Because if we can get this economy moving, it's going to be so much better for the people, those hardworking American families. So this is the concern I have, and tell me what you think we should do immediately. I mean, immediately. And I'd like to hear an answer from everyone here. What should we do immediately? Because tax reform is difficult. Mr. Ratner, I'll start with you.
Look, unfortunately, I think it's a package. I think you need a comprehensive package that addresses all the various issues we've been talking about today. So I don't think going in now and cutting the corporate tax rate to 15% or 25% and saying, okay, we've done our job is anything remotely like a solution. I think you guys have a huge job on your hands with thousands of pieces. So I don't think, unfortunately, you can do it today or tomorrow or the next day. I think you need to take some time and do it right.
My thinking would be we have to be bold. And as you go through this process, as we just heard, it is complicated. There's thousands of pieces. But let's be bold and let's get everything on the table and let's fix it.
I agree. We need to be bold, and we need to bring all the constituents in, smaller people, the people in the factory, all the way up to the boardrooms. And we need to think about all the impacts of these individuals and what it means. But we need to reinvest in America. Get the money back in America.
Mr. Model.
Lower it, simplify it, and change the way you collect it.
Mr. Stevens.
Lower the rate, create a cycle of virtuous investment, and do it right away.
I do, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate every one of your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Holding, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Peterson, in your testimony, you've pointed out numerous times the competitive flaw in our current worldwide tax system versus the territorial tax system. And this is an extremely important point and an area that we obviously need to address in tax reform. Everyone has agreed to that. I don't think I've taken a single meeting where someone has argued against addressing our international tax code. Because while other countries have moved to a territorial tax system, we're one of the last remaining countries to tax the worldwide profits of U.S. headquartered companies. The others include Greece, Chile, Mexico, and South Korea. Now, an even more exclusive company, we're only one of two countries, Eritrea being the other, to tax the worldwide income of U.S. citizens that live and work in foreign jurisdictions. Now, we stand in even more exclusive because we're the only country that has, through its tax code, put both our companies and our citizens at a competitive disadvantage on the global stage. It's pretty remarkable when you think of it. So, Mr. Peterson, you're the CEO of a company with global operations. Could you give me your firsthand perspective on how our tax code has affected the international competitiveness of both U.S. companies abroad, as well as the ability for you to hire Americans for jobs in overseas operations?
Thank you. On the first point about some of the competitiveness, let me give you a couple of examples. In my testimony, I mentioned that we pay a tax rate of well over 30%, and we have competitors pay in the teens. We have a competitor who is based in Canada that operates globally, one of our largest competitors, that pays a rate of about 12%. There is another one of our competitors that did an inversion and moved their operations to the United Kingdom and went from a 30% tax rate to a 12% tax rate. In addition to that, I mentioned earlier recent acquisitions by companies moving all of their offshore cash into international operations and doing acquisitions overseas. We are competing on a global scale. We pay the 30% rate. They pay at 12, 15% rates. This is something we feel every time we go out and have a situation we're competing in the markets. Our employees, when we move expatriates around the world, or we try to hire Americans in other markets, they have a tax advantage, obviously. We pay our employees the same rates, which means that for us it's also an increased cost. We would like somebody to have the same net income, and that means that we're paying for also their tax assistance when they're overseas. So there is an additional burden for us to have Americans when we move them overseas.
So well, this example makes sense to you. I have a friend who works in mergers and acquisitions. They were buying a company in Hong Kong, and they were looking at moving some U.S. citizens to Hong Kong to work in executive positions there at this newly acquired company. And my friend was telling me that it would cost 40% more to hire a U.S. citizen to do the exact same job in Hong Kong.
That would be the right increase, whether you're looking at people from the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, or from Singapore, Hong Kong, et cetera. They're always going to be about a 40% cost differential to hire an American.
I outdid this. I got paid $125,000 a year. It cost the company $500,000 a year to have me in Hong Kong. That's the real cost of having international.
Right, right. You know, I've also found, I've always been struck, you know, you go to a foreign country as a member of Congress, and we always want to meet with the American Chamber of Commerce, you know, there in the country, whether it be, you know, Hong Kong, we're talking about Hong Kong. And often we go there and we don't see Americans there, but we'll see British there or New Zealanders there, Australians there as executives in U.S. companies based overseas. So I think when we address the global system, the territorial system, we need to address how our citizens are treated as well, particularly for their earned income, and look at that as a residency-based taxation and align our citizens along with our companies as to how the rest of the world treats them for tax purposes. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our guests today. This is a critically important first hearing. I'm a new member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and I can tell you that the people that I represent sent me to Washington to try to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. And I'm really excited that we are having a hearing today about tax reform. You know, I think it's really important that the tax reform be comprehensive and truly be a tax reform. I'm a true believer that our tax code is in dire need of meaningful reform. I have no doubt that by working together in a bipartisan manner, both parties have a once-in-a-generation chance to really pass comprehensive tax reform that will benefit the middle class, small businesses, and hardworking Americans across this country. You know, my concern, though, is that the current administration's plan doesn't seem to be a product of collaborative work. I think it's really important, you've heard us echo this a couple of times, and I know that our chairman is listening, and I know that he, too, understands the value of collaborative work. We all want this tax reform to truly be lasting and not just a mere one-off. Every day, I'm honored to represent my home district of Alabama, the 7th Congressional District. The median income in my district is, for a family of four, is $38,000. But I know what's possible with a little bit of resources and a whole bunch of opportunities from this district. I get to live it every day. The challenge, of course, is to try to figure out how we can promote viability, great opportunities for both businesses and workers. I know that by sitting in a collaborative manner that we can achieve both, that there can be winners and not just winners and losers. But I have to say that I was quite concerned that what we're looking at in this current tax proposal is just more tax cuts and not true tax reform. I find it to be telling that we've been in this room for the last 3 hours almost talking about comprehensive tax reform, and Vice President Pence just tweeted 20 minutes ago, I know that this president will sign into law the most consequential tax cut in American history. It can't just be another tax cut, gentlemen. It needs to truly be comprehensive tax reform. I know the folks that I represent have been waiting for trickle-down economics to trickle down to them, and the spigot is always off by the time it gets to rural America. And I think we have to figure out a way to make this work. So my question, I guess, is my first question is to you, Mr. Ratner. We talked about making sure that any tax reform is deficit neutral. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can make it distributionally neutral as well. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of supply-side economics, which you said, like trickle-down economics, doesn't try to trickle down to the middle class and to the working class. So can you talk a little bit about making sure any kind of comprehensive tax reform that we consider is also distributionally neutral?
Sure, Congresswoman, and thank you for your comments. I would say a couple things. First of all, I agree that it needs to be comprehensive tax reform, not just tax cuts, regardless of what the distributional effects are. I think I would recognize that the President, in his plan, does propose to simplify the deductions on the personal side. We can debate what should or shouldn't be in there, but I think certainly that's a step in the right direction, and we should commend him for doing that. My problem is the distributional effects. I mentioned before that 83% of this tax cut on the individual side goes to the top 20% of Americans, an average of $25,000 each. 50%, a full 50% of this tax cut would go to the top 1%, an average of $317,000 each. So that doesn't seem fair to me, and I don't think it's complicated to fix that. It's simply a question of what rate cuts do you give to what level of Americans, and it's just making some adjustments to those formulas. I don't think it's terribly complicated. It's just something we need to do.
Mr. Farr, I'm a firm believer that our tax code should incentivize the type of behavior we want to see. For me, I know that the future of work in the rural parts of my district is really quite scary. And so incentivizing apprenticeship programs and workforce development and workforce training is really important. Each Congress I try to introduce bills that reflect that. Can you discuss the role tax reform can play in helping companies like Emerson promote workforce development?
For sure. First of all, you have to know I'm a 9-iron from Ferguson, and we've put $12 million into Ferguson for the last 2 years, including an apprenticeship programs for the high school kids. I went out and raised $2 million in we're funding. I think that you find businesses do this, and we don't really need incentive from federal governments. We want to help our communities. So I think that you'll quickly find out that businesses, if they are really engaged in the community, will do it. And I do this lively, and I tell you what, and Ferguson's much better today than it was 2 years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Swiker, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And when we all sit down here, we always have a series of things we think we want to ask. And this is to all my brothers and sisters sitting up here on the dais. Maybe I'm being pathologically optimistic. And outside, look, some of the political banter that seems to be obligational to throw out. If you actually hear from the right and the left here, I think there is sort of a universal understanding that we need big, bold, comprehensive tax reform. This discussion, if you actually look at what we're doing, and look, I don't know whatever noise is out in the rest of the world, take a look at our documents. This isn't just about rates. This is big-time reform. And so look, I have a personal fixation on this concept of velocity in our society. How many of our brothers and sisters out there, all up and down the tree, if you actually look at like the last 10, 14, 15 years, how little movement there really have been from different sort of stratifications. And that's a crisis for society when you don't see that movement. I'm desperately hoping for all of you as entrepreneurs and investors that a comprehensive plan as we're moving forward is great for the society, from the person entering workforce to the person who just wants stability and wants opportunity. Mr. Farr, one of the things I wanted to come to you about was when you also look at investments around the world, and you're making that decision of, for your shareholders, what is in this tax plan, our tax plan, that makes you decide it's going to happen here in North America? What are we doing right, and what would you change?
One of the panelists said, I think education in the United States is truly unique. We have a unique education system that drives innovation and technology, and I think if you can continue to encourage that in this tax plan, that's very important. Secondly, I think getting that tax rate down, so when I look at my tax costs to do business in the United States versus England versus UK or China, wherever that is, getting that tax rate down, that takes it off the table. For the productivity, the education, the strength of the U.S. worker is very strong, and that's very important.
Okay, so that's your baseline. Now we're coming to you and saying we're about to do comprehensive tax reform for our society. Does the expensing, do the rates, what are the drivers that say you're going to continue to invest in our communities?
I think all those come into play from the standpoint that the acceleration of the depreciation makes a big difference from the standpoint of the recovery of the cash we put in and putting that cash back out into other investments. I think the tax rate from the standpoint of how much cash we pay in federal taxes or state local taxes make a big difference. But again, I think having infrastructure, having all these things come into play, I'll go through 20 issues relative to making a decision. It's not just tax.
Okay, so it's unified theory, but right now our job is to get the tax and then we have, and we'll have other things we have to do. Ms. Mott, you made a comment before that you've had to change your business model or your production lines, your research multiple times because you keep losing your customers. Could you put a little more definition on that?
Yeah, well, for almost 100 years, we primarily served the telecom industry. It was my great-grandfather's account. And I watched as other countries made a very competitive environment for the people that made the chips, the boards, and all those little pieces that go in the electronics. And then they no longer needed me to make a housing here to hold those boards and electronics. It went overseas to another country. So, I watched that industry leave. I watched, for a while, we did some automotive work. There were some issues, as have been mentioned. We watched that change and disappear. Now that type of work is leaving.
So in many ways, you're sort of speaking to where I was trying to go before. It's more, there's also a cascade effect. And for all of us here, we sometimes get fixated on a single point in a complex plan and not understanding there's sort of a unified theory where this affects this affects that touches here. And this is not just business. I mean, we're also, looking at how we deal with the pass-throughs, also individual rates, and how it all sort of unifies together. For AT&T, what is the single biggest driver to get you as one of the biggest players in the world to make large capital investments in this country?
The two biggest drivers would be the tax rate and the immediate expensing, but quite frankly, the biggest driver would be those changes as they impact my customers.
Okay.
Because right now, just as Mr. Model mentioned, we're losing customers who are taking their business overseas. The work that he talked about in the auto industry went overseas where I'm not the primary provider. When he talked about those micro boards and other equipment being manufactured overseas, I lost that customer. So for us, let's be straight. We really believe that doing these changes will generate small business and medium-sized business activity, and that will benefit us through the revenue line.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lewinsky, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I am grateful to represent Indiana's 2nd District. We're one of the largest manufacturing districts in the country. Very proud of the folks in our district. We have a lot of manufacturers, farmers, a lot of moms and dads that are just trying to pay bills and trying to get their kids through school and through college. And I've heard from so many CEOs in my district that the American economy has succeeded in spite of our tax code. It hasn't helped it. And I wanted to be a part of this committee, and I am grateful to be a part of the committee to actually be looking at this. And I want to just run a couple of quotes past you on what folks in my district have said. Barry Baldwin's a tax preparer. He talks about why it's important to lower the rates. And we've had this discussion for 3 hours on rates. And my question to you when I get there will be on rates and the issue of permanency and why it's so important to you that we don't do something that would damage, your interest in tax reform by not making this permanent. But Baldwin, the tax preparer, says more money in people's pockets leading to more spending. More spending creates more jobs increase the tax base. Gary Fox, he's a managing partner for a tax services firm in my district called Crow Horwath in South Bend. He said small and middle market companies are unable to keep capital and invest in their business with the current tax rate environments. He said lower rates will allow for better capital investment, capitalization, increased full-time employment. And then since we're a manufacturer, we manufacture nearly all the RVs in the country and worldwide. We also manufacture boats. So Peter Barrett, Senior VP of Smokercraft, said that tax cuts will allow his company to hire more workers, raise wages for their 600 employees, create new training programs, expand their plant, and make new capital equipment purchases. None of those things, he said, happen in a vacuum. So you've heard from my district, I've heard from you, but and you touched on this a little bit earlier, why lower rates are so important. But I guess when we talk about this, the benefit of lower rates, and you touched a little bit on the issue of permanency, I just think it's important that as we talk about this, we talk about what the distractions can be if this isn't permanent. And that's how I'd like to hear your response, the issue of permanency and why it should be a top priority. Mr. Stevens. So for most of the large companies, capital investments are multi-year projects. It takes years to go from the start to completion. And so as the rules change, as inconsistencies change, as the rules change, once again, for our customers, and so we see demand for our services change, it makes things inconsistent and it puts higher risk. Higher risk makes people in our world be more careful with their investments. It's just a prudent responsibility we have to our shareholders. So whether that inconsistency is in tax rates or uncertainty, whether it's in regulatory conditions, all of that goes to uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to less investment.
think I've spent some time in your district, visited some of those RV manufacturers. Is Goshen, Indiana, is out there?
You bet, right in the
I
middle.
love it out there, great area. But I wanted the thing about the concern and the risk of constant changing. We talk about here in Congress, we can't get things done because of the distraction maybe going on, right? There's no air in the room. It's the same thing in business. If we're constantly concerned about changes and who's going to jerk our chain next, we don't do anything. We freeze up and pause. So I think it's so important to have a consistent policy. Also I've heard a lot about supply side things. We're really talking here about demand. I'm not an economist, I'm a manufacturer, but we keep hearing about supply. We want to generate demand for American workers, demand for training, demand for skills. I have a skilled workforce shortage in my area, and I can't hire the people to run the machines that we need. And so I've had to raise wages. So if we can create more demand, you will see a lot more of that. Thank you.
The key issue you hear from, you've got a medium, small, large business here. We're all interconnected. So whatever happens to one happens to the other. And I think the permanency is very, very important because we do make long-term plans. And if we have the risk issue that it's going to go away next year, then we'll factor that in. We'll slow it down, maybe spend less money. But it does have an impact. Why the rates are important? Because I operate in a global marketplace. Like I said, over half my sales are outside the United States. My major competitors are German, French, maybe a Japanese. They all have lower rates. And if we have higher rates, I lose business. I just recently lost an acquisition in Germany to a French company for a $500 million acquisition. Same forecast. My tax rate's 37%. His tax rate is 20%. And I lose every day of the week.
Mr. Peterson.
Tax is a major expenditure for us. As I mentioned, $560 million last year in the U.S. If we knew what the cost was going to be and it was lower than that, and we're able to predict it over the long run, we can have a completely different planning cycle and also invest for the long run. Permanency is absolutely critical to this package.
Mr. Ratner.
I would certainly echo that, but I would also just mention something the committee is well aware of, which is that achieving permanency creates an additional burden in terms of how this package is constructed in terms of the legislative process, particularly in the Senate, that you're all obviously very well aware of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Delbeni, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. I've been spending time collecting feedback from my constituents about what tax reform means to them. I represent a very diverse district in Washington State with industries ranging from a booming high technology sector to life sciences and agriculture. And I can tell you that my constituents are asking for middle class and small business tax relief, not massive unpaid for tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and large corporations. I heard from a mom who's struggling to pay tuition for 3 children in college and could use just a little bit of relief. I heard from a small business owner who's spending $12,000 a year on a CPA to help him navigate the complexities of the current tax code instead of putting that money back into his business. And he's still paying a high tax rate. There are countless stories, we've heard some here today, just like this across my district and across the country, from hardworking people who just want a bit of fairness and simplicity out of tax reform. And we've talked about simplicity, we've talked about certainty, also very important. We've talked about competitiveness. I want to talk a little bit, though, more about fairness and true impact. And so I want to share some data about what happened after the Bush tax cuts. According to a U.S. Census report, median household income in 2007 was lower than it was in the year 2000. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, employment and wage and salary growth were lower than in any previous post-World War II expansion. So, Mr. Ratner, I wanted to ask you, what should we take away from what happened after the Bush tax cuts?
Well, I certainly did not think the Bush tax cuts were well advised. We had a surplus when President Bush arrived. We effectively squandered it, created deficits, and as you pointed out, with no meaningful positive economic impact. So I think the lesson of all that is not to do it again.
And how should that inform us going forward, given as we look at tax cuts in particular?
Well, that should inform us first and foremost that they should be deficit neutral, and that you all, well, you're not in charge of all spending, obviously, but you need to somehow, with your colleagues, make sure that the total package that ends up going through is deficit neutral using reasonable assumptions. And secondly, while I think there is a benefit in reducing rates generally, we should also, for example, there was a discussion about R&D and the importance of that. We should also look I'm not in favor of huge numbers of gimmicks or overly targeted tax cuts, but we should make sure the tax code is creating the incentives we want it to create, not just to invest, but to train, to educate, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Mr. Stevens, you said, I think pretty straightforward, more investments equal more jobs in your testimony. In a 2016 New York Times article entitled Gearing Up for the Cloud, AT&T tells its workers adapt or else. It really talks about AT&T shifting its business towards more of a digital and computing-based business. There's also a quote in that article that said executives estimate that eventually AT&T could get by with 1/3 fewer workers, probably due to automation, et cetera. So while you work with your workforce to train for the jobs of the future, if you're also going to have 1/3 less of a workforce due to automation or technology changes, that means that more investments may not mean more jobs or more workers. And so I am concerned about the idea that investment alone is always going to equal new jobs as we talk about the new economy. And I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Sure. What we are doing at AT&T is our business is changing. If you're like my children, you don't have a dial tone phone at home, you use your mobile phone. And as happens across the country, we've gone from about 55 million of those dial tone phones down to about 25 million. So business changes. And so we need less people to take care of, a 40, 50% loss in that customer base. What we're doing, though, is we're giving those individuals the opportunity to retrain themselves. We use nano degrees. We have partnered with Georgia Tech University for an online programming at the company's cost to give our employees an opportunity to train themselves in the next generation of products and services.
And so I just want to, I understand that retraining, it just still means there are less jobs, and so more investment meaning less jobs, and because I'm running out of time, I just think it's important that we have an honest conversation about what technology means for the workforce and where we should be putting resources to make sure that we actually have an economy that really works for everyone. And I'm out of time, and so I just want to yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Curbelo, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this hearing, and I thank the witnesses. I'm also grateful that my colleagues have expressed broad bipartisan support for comprehensive, permanent, and revenue-neutral tax reform. We have the opportunity to reform and streamline existing programs in the tax code, like education incentives that will give families more flexibility in saving for their children, promoting greater access to cleaner, more efficient energy technologies, and seeking solutions for the people of Puerto Rico who face a demoralizing economic outlook. But for me, Mr. Chairman, tax reform is about expanding freedom and opportunity for the American families of today and those of the future. I think about my immigrant parents and how they were able to come to this country and earn success. When they first arrived, it was tough. My mom helped her mother run a small fabrics business. On some days, my dad sought food and couldn't find any. Yet, thanks to the possibilities afforded to them by the American economy, they were able to earn more, put away some money, buy an apartment, and start a family. The social safety net back then was not as expansive as it is today, but opportunity was boundless. My wife and I think about our own two daughters. I want to make sure they grow up in a country where they can find their own success and blossom. The decisions we make in this committee in the coming months will make that either more or less possible. I think of all those young people who went to college and can't find quality jobs, and small businesses back in South Florida, the mom and pop bakeries and small restaurants where I often stop by in the mornings to grab my shot of Cuban coffee. Will our country offer them the opportunity to grow and invest? Or will we just sit back and watch opportunity in our country diminish? There's good news in the blueprint for every Florida family. My state could see as many as 97,220 new jobs and an estimated gain in after-tax income of $4,248 per household, according to the Tax Foundation. Counties like Miami-Dade and Monroe, which I'm privileged to represent, I think especially stand to benefit given the entrepreneurial culture there. To our witnesses today, I have one question, very unique to my area. Miami, South Florida is often called the gateway of the Americas. There's so many opportunities, so many ways to access different markets from Miami. However, we also face competition from all those countries in Central, South America, Europe, and really all over the world, because Miami is becoming a meeting point for people and goods from all over the world. Mr. Farr, given your perspective, for those entrepreneurs in Miami who are creating jobs, who are innovating, who are opening new markets for American products, what is the difference for them between permanent comprehensive reform and short-term tax cuts?
Thank you. First of all, we use Miami as our gateway into Latin America, so that's where our headquarters is. I mean, the big impact for people starting up is with having the tax rate will allow them to make those long-term investments. I mean, when you start a company up, you're putting money in the line, it's going to be there for a long time, and you want to know what that tax structure is going to be. And I think that's very critical for these young people starting up these companies, having impermanence, having the knowledge what that tax rate is going to be, what the rules are, and make them simple. For small companies, they have to be simple. I have hundreds of tax lawyers and tax accountants to deal with this, but in small companies, you got to make them real simple, keep the rates low, and they'll invest and grow, and that's how it works.
Thank you, Mr. Farr. Mr. Stevens, I want to offer you the opportunity to send a message to the American worker. We all know how frustrated the American worker is. A lot of people in this country just don't feel like success is attainable for them. A lot of these young people go to college, get a degree. They were promised that they would be able to find a good job, and they can't find one today. And a lot of these people have watched over the last 7, 8 years this economic recovery where the wealthy have done quite well. The statistics show that, yet lower and middle income Americans have struggled. Some of these people might be watching this hearing today, maybe 1 or 2 of them, hopefully more. What do you have to say to them? Why is this important to them? How can comprehensive, bold, permanent tax reform improve quality of life for middle and lower income Americans?
So for all businessmen, the question of investments comes down to what returns they can make. And when the government takes 40% between the Fed and state, and another location takes 20% or less, it makes it very difficult to make the decision to invest here. If we balance that out, if we make that competitive, those investments will come here. This will be the biggest jobs bill that this committee could support, because with those dollars of investments comes the opportunities to do research, do innovation, do construction.
So tax reform equals more and better jobs.
It's a jobs bill first.
Let's leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to be here on this very important hearing, and thank you for your tenacity in pursuing this package of tax reform measures. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your testimony here today. Thanks for sticking it out with us. I'm the last of the group. Ms. Chu and I will be the last, and so much has been discussed. We all have the same interest. We want to deliver comprehensive tax reform. We think it, in this case, the blueprint in front of us will deliver profound tax relief to all Americans, and that's what we're hoping to see. I'm from Michigan. Lots of great things going on in Michigan, but manufacturing is very important. It's our lifeblood. And I want to share with you a letter and an article that I read in New York Magazine on May 15th from a gentleman by the name of Mark Schmidt, who is also the president of a company called Atlas Tool. They're out of Roseville, Michigan. His testimonial on the existence of the tool and die industry is alarming, given the fact that this is America. We can't afford this to happen, but he suggests that the United States manufacturing sector is dying. The tool and die business in particular is gone. His business, which is full of employees with high skilled and their well-compensated workforce, is being choked off. And it's because we have done nothing to level this playing field. And I would just like to know, given the short amount of time that we have, and I know you can't do everything to give solutions here, but his suggestion is that the Chinese prices are so low that they cannot afford to buy their major dies from anywhere else, the major manufacturers. And he lists why they're low, and most of it has to do with China subsidizing their businesses. He also said that the industry has lost approximately 70% of its companies and 80% of its skilled jobs. And the most alarming thing, his conclusion was, our industry will soon lack sufficient capacity to supply the free world's automotive market. If that doesn't send off bells and whistles, and if that doesn't tell us that this is absolutely the most urgent thing that we can be doing right now in terms of public policy, I don't know what will. So I guess I'll start with you, Mr. Model. This is your namesake, so I better make sure that I ask you first what you think about this, and if there's anything that we can do right now that would address this problem.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bishop. I know the company, sometimes we get their phone calls, we send them the right way, and sometimes I hope they reciprocate. But, the issue you're talking about is exactly what's happened in my business, too. And, the problem is, well, I don't know if it's a problem, but we need to make a profit here. And we're competing against companies that don't need to make a profit. Their banks will keep giving them loans and loans and loans just to have full employment. So the Chinese just flew their first jetliner. I'm afraid, I talked about the industries I've lost. Now I'm in aerospace and I'm in medical. So I'm worried what's going to happen to the aerospace industry when they have to compete against a company that has no need to make a profit, only to corner the market. So, and that's a fine strategy for that country, and kudos to them for pursuing it. But how can we engage in a different way so companies like Atlas Tool and my Atlas Tool can be competitive? We can create demand. I think it's right here in this room. We're talking about it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Farr, I know you're
I'm
chomping
ready to go on this one. I tell you what, we've lost so much of our industrial base because of our antiquated tax policies, and we've allowed these companies to leave. We've allowed technology to leave. President Roosevelt took over our 2 facilities of manufacturing in 1939 for one reason: all our tool and die makers. He took over all our plants and almost put us out of business during the war because we couldn't make motors anymore. But this technology is leaving, and we got to figure out how to invest back in this country. Again, not only lower taxes, but put money back into education, into R&D. We can compete against the Chinese if we have a level playing field. Americans want to compete to win, and I believe that wholeheartedly.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I know you're pressed for time, so I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
Mr. Ratner, I would like to ask you about tax reform as it relates to small businesses. For every year that I've served in Congress, I've served also on the Small Business Committee, and it's because I truly believe that small business is the key to the American dream. In fact, my grandfather came to California with nothing but opened up a small Chinese restaurant, and it just had a handful of employees. It was not a fancy place, but he worked day and night and day, and it was enough to keep the family going. Now, the Trump tax plan slashes the tax rate for pass-through entities from the current rates to a rate of 15%, claiming that this is a tax cut for small businesses. But just this week, the Tax Policy Center found that over 3/4 of the benefits of this cut would accrue to the top 1% of earners. In fact, the top 1% would see their after-tax incomes climb to $76,000. So, Mr. Ratner, could you elaborate on how and why this tax cut would be so beneficial to the wealthiest few?
I'm sorry, Congressman, that last part, elaborate on what?
How this tax cut would be beneficial to the wealthiest.
Well, as I said before, there are many wealthy people, and I think the study you cited seems to have some, put together some data, but there are hedge funds, there are private equity funds, there are businesses that are not really small businesses, there are publicly traded firms that are taxed as pass-throughs with billion-dollar plus market capitalizations, and they would all receive that 75%, I think you said, of the benefits of this. And so I think that the idea of lowering the tax rates for true small businesses is certainly a worthwhile goal, but I express some skepticism about the ability to address the pass-throughs in some way where you leave one group on one side paying their fair share and the other group on the other side getting some benefit. I think it's a very, very hard thing to do, and I think, frankly, our current system with the pass-throughs is probably a better system, but without lowering the rates to 15%, because I think that would confer too many benefits on the wealthy.
In fact, let me follow up on that, because so many people refer to to the pass-through income as if it were all small business income. And in fact, many have argued that this type of rate reduction is critical to the success of small businesses. But can you tell us what kinds of businesses would qualify as pass-throughs? Are there any distinctions drawn between the mom-and-pop restaurant or wealthy lawyers and lobbying firms? For instance, would the Trump Organization be a pass-through?
Trump Organization would be a pass-through, but as we know, he doesn't pay a lot of taxes anyway, so I'm not sure how much benefit he would get. Look, the administration has said that it would address the problem that you and I are both talking about of excessive, undeserved benefits going to very wealthy individuals or very, very successful large businesses. But they have produced no specifics, and as I said, I'm personally reasonably skeptical that there is a way to draw those lines to give benefits to those who truly deserve them without having a lot of leakage, so to speak, to people who don't deserve them. I have many friends who are in the investment business who operate as pass-throughs, and I don't see any reason why they or I should get a 15% tax rate.
Let me turn now to the Kansas model. I was very interested to see that in 2012, Kansas cut taxes dramatically. They, in fact, exempted pass-throughs from paying any state income tax at all. They cut the taxes on profits for more than 100,000 businesses. In fact, the largest benefits were for upper middle class households. And there was massive revenue losses. Kansas was then forced to raise the sales tax, skip pension payments, and even shorten the school year to save money. Can you comment on what is happening in Kansas and how could we avoid this pitfall on the federal level?
I'm not an expert on Kansas, but I think it highlights a critical issue that we've talked about in this committee hearing, but I think really needs to be front and center, which is that there is no free lunch, unfortunately. That you can't simply, Kansas was in effect a supply-side experiment. We'll cut taxes massively. We think there'll be so much economic activity it will somehow make up for that lost revenue, and it didn't happen. And it hasn't happened in the past with tax cuts at the federal level either. Tax cuts are fine, but they do not pay for themselves. They simply don't. And that's the lesson that this committee needs to be mindful of. And in constructing its tax package, it should be deficit neutral using reasonable economic assumptions. So all the things that we all advocate, you all have to find a way to pay for them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I came here, I was chairman of Horry County Council in Horry County, South Carolina, and I saw firsthand how counties compete vigorously to attract investment by industry through regulatory changes, tax changes, and then states like South Carolina, for example, one of the top 5 states to do business, have done the same thing to attract, to be more competitive and to attract investment in its work. BMW, Boeing, Volvo, Mercedes, and on and on and on. But what has our country done? You know, what our country fails to recognize, we argue about, you know, maintaining this level of revenue or that, or how these benefits are going to be dispersed through society, but the fact that we've got to recognize is that we are in a global competition. You know, we can change a lot of laws here in Washington, but one law that we can't change is economic law, and we can't change the law of economic competition. I have a question. Mr. Model, I thought your testimony was right on point about the border adjustment and the VAT and why other countries have done that. They agree to lower tariffs in trade agreements, and then they put in VATs, and it's simply a disguised tariff, and it puts us at a huge disadvantage. Mr. Model, just assume this scenario. You've got an American company paying a 35% tax rate, and you've got a European company, an Irish company, paying a 13% tax rate and a VAT. And they both compete to buy the same materials, they both make the same product, and they both compete globally for the same customers. Can you tell me the end of that story?
The one with the VAT tax is going to win because they refund that money when they export it.
The American company is either going to go bankrupt or they're going to get bought by the Irish company, right?
Absolutely, sir.
Mr. Ratner, do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree with that, but I think we have to recognize that the VAT would have a number of consequences and uncertainties. First of all, it would be a massive upheaval in our economy as certain companies benefited.
But we also recognize, we also have to recognize there's 150 or 40 other countries around the world, including every single major industrialized country, including every one of our competitors that are doing the exact same thing. And how can we sit here on our hands and put our American companies at a disadvantage to those?
Well, it's not completely one-sided. We have state and local sales taxes which function as a form of VAT, admittedly at a lower level. But remember that this is all predicated on some very uncertain adjustment in the dollar, which if it does not happen, would involve raising prices very, very substantially for middle and working class Americans who typically buy a higher percentage of their goods imported than people like we do.
Income tax cuts. If the currency doesn't adjust fully, there'll be some increase in prices. But based on these tax foundation estimates, their incomes will go up by $4,000 a year, far more than these potential sales costs would. You know, the size of the American middle class and their income level has really declined. It's not a recent phenomenon. It's declined in the last 8 years. It declined the 8 years before that and the 8 years before that. I mean, it has been going down since 1990, 20 years. The last time the code was revised was 1986. I wonder if there's some maybe correlation there. The decline of the American middle class and the growing income inequality that we all fuss about is a direct and foreseeable result of the continued deterioration of America as a place to do business. Our tax code puts American companies at a disadvantage, and that translates to the loss of millions of middle-class American jobs. If we truly want to grow the middle class, if we want to give them a raise, if we want to reduce income inequality, we must make our tax code competitive in the world. That has got to be our #1 goal. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things. The American economy, we're 5% of the world's population. We're about 23% of the world's economy. We have the strongest economy in the history of the world. But despite all the macroeconomic indicators pointing up, job growth, low unemployment, growth in the stock market, we lost 6 million manufacturing jobs in the past 15 years. 56,000 factories have closed. We just had an election where 2 unconventional candidates rose pretty quickly on both sides. Donald Trump, our current president, beat 16 established Republican candidates. Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side was challenged by a 73-year-old socialist from Vermont who garnered 12 million votes and won 21 primaries or caucuses. There's something underlying that isn't being addressed, and I would argue that it's income inequality, and regardless of our political persuasion, we all have a major stake in this. Let me give you an example. Between 1945 and 1980, we had productivity gains in the American economy by 97%. Real income and wages grew at the same time by 95%. There was shared prosperity. Economists would call that a virtuous cycle or circle of growth. And the American CEO felt it was their responsibility to balance the economic interests of all of the stakeholders. The shareholders, the owners of businesses, the managers, and the employees, and the communities within which these corporations operated. Between 1980 and present, we'd have productivity gains in the American economy by 89%. Real income and wages have grown by 9.75%. So if you're looking for the cause of the political disruption that people just voted for, it's that underlying issue of economic inequality. Now, I think a lot of people would view that personally and say, well, that means more taxes for me, and I oppose that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think we can reach a point at which we can move our tax policy out of a political realm. Perhaps that's naive. But tax policy either works or it doesn't. I think supply side is discredited. The new term for that is dynamic scoring. It basically says the tax cuts will pay for themselves. Tax cuts do not pay for themselves, ever. So I think what we need to do is address what's going on here in the American economy. Because, as I said, people voted for disruption. Mr. Ratner, let me just say this to you. Supply side trickle down dynamic scoring says, let's give the very wealthy a big tax cut, and that money will find its way back into the economy in new business investment in job growth. Right? Wrong. It hasn't worked. Today, American companies are holding $2.5 trillion abroad, an increase of nearly 20% in the last 2 years. It's 14% of the American economy. United States companies are holding $1.94 trillion in cash domestically. Zero-yielding money markets are holding $2.66 trillion in investor cash, and banks are holding over $2 trillion in excess reserves in the Federal Reserve. Taken together, that's over $9 trillion. Why isn't that money finding its way in the American economy, and why would massive tax cuts to the wealthy have any measurable difference in what it hasn't done historically? Mr. Ratner.
I think there's a number of complex reasons around what you're saying. First, I think the issues with manufacturing in the U.S. are not simply a function of the tax code. There's a whole variety of factors that have caused us to lose quite a number of our manufacturing jobs, particularly the rise of other countries being able to do what we do. Secondly, as you point out, there is an abundance of capital in this country. What there is a lack of are investment opportunities. Some of that may have to do with the tax code. A lot of it has to do with the perception that our economy is not growing that fast. There isn't that much demand, and so why build a factory to make something if you don't have people out there with the money to buy it? I see we're out of time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. This is a discussion about how we grow jobs, grow paychecks in the U.S. economy, and the role tax reforming is doing that. You've made all a very compelling argument for bold tax reform, permanent tax reform, and doing it now. So I want to thank you for being here today. Please be aware the members of the committee have 2 weeks to submit to you written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions, your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. And again, on behalf of the committee, thank you. The committee stands adjourned.
So leave the pads out, you think, Chris? Yeah, everything. Put everything in on the lower dice. All right. Oh, because this is a subcommittee hearing. Yeah. So. Oh shoot. Yeah. I forgot about that. That makes sense.